Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku gave one for all to Mirio? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Oh my god. He's got a child in his arms. Somebody help. Where are the police and heroes? A villain had appeared, and like the drop of a hat, the balmy and serene air of the Mustafa Park had turned chilly, frigid, tense. Dozens of horrified faces turned against the afternoon sun to watch the silhouette of a heavily cloaked lizard-human rise above the tree line in a swell of lavender-colored magic. The villain's form was illuminated in the same pulsating purple energy that trailed his movements, and sure enough, there was an elementary-aged child shrieking and kicking in his grasp. A gray-green lizard-like snout poked out from under his cloak, and his sneer was the only definitive feature that the crowd below could make out. Two massive fangs curled down from his mouth like a pair of porcelain kitchen knives. Across the park, a tall teenager grabbed his shorter friend by the shoulders. "I can feel it. One for all is begging me to use it. Come on, Izuku." The two teens ran behind an ice cream stall on the opposing side of the park, the vendor of the stall too preoccupied by the villain attack to pay them heed. The older and taller of the two high school students, an athletic boy with sun-embraced cheeks and navy blue eyes, doubled over, curling in on himself, his balled-up fists pulled tight to his belly. Rays of afternoon sun turned strands of sandy blonde hair into shimmering gold, and sizable swells of strong muscle bulged along his biceps and forearms as the boy flexed. His eyes darkened and face tightened in concentration. He wasn't dressed for hero work, wearing blue jeans and a button-down, but he didn't seem deterred in the slightest. He wiggled his feet to open his stance a little, breathing deeply, feeling out the ground, feeling for the right posture. "Mirio, remember, egg in a microwave," the younger student cautioned, leaning forward to analyze how the other boy was distributing his weight. This smaller student had a mop of unruly green hair, like a scattering of pine needles had been swept into a large pile and then dumped on his head, and a sprinkle of dark freckles across the apple of each cheek. His eyes suggested an intelligence far beyond that of the average high schooler, but his actions betrayed him to still be just a boy at heart, his body and his movements awkward and his words coming out uncertain and shy. So, instead of adding something wise and meaningful, he just said again, "Don't explode the egg. You need way less power than you think you do." "Got it. Need less than I think I do. Here we go." The older boy swallowed strong, a wide smile taking over his features as his confidence visibly built inside of him. More, a pause, a deep breath, and then the older student spoke the second word of his self-declared catchphrase as he leapt forward, "Pow." And in an explosion of reddish-white energy, before he even finished the second syllable in the word power, Mirio Togata was gone. Izuku Midoriya smacked his palm to his face, because he already knew from the cracks left behind in the pavement that Mirio had channeled far too much of One for All's energy to clear this barely 30-meter jump. The lower-classmen ran around the ice cream stall just in time to see the black and red plaid blur that was Mirio's button-down streak by the villain, who had simply levitated to the side to avoid the projectile human who had just come careening his way. Even the boy he'd snatched up had stopped his squirming to gawk at Mirio as he sailed past. So much for egg in a microwave. Izuku made a mental note to work on a better analogy with Mirio later, one to hopefully help the older boy reel in his issue with giving the quirk too much gas, as he'd had power-level-related mishaps the last 3 times he'd attempted to use the quirk. "Guess this means it's up to me." The boy rolled his wrists and flexed his fists, turning his attention inward, seeking that familiar part of his belly and zesty that housed the energy he knew to be One for All. He'd used One for All twice since last giving it to Mirio, so was there even any power left to call on? Still here, something seemed to whisper in his mind, the dialogue more like an itch against the inside of his skull than a voice actually saying any words. Izuku decided he would try to use it at full power, which, in his case, was only 20%, as he usually had enough residual energy from One for All to use the quirk 2 or 3 more times in Candid before it vanished entirely. Izuku fell into a squat, pulled his fists in front of his face, and summoned the quirk. The energy responded to his call in kind, the familiar lightning-hot thrum of one for all shooting across his body, from inside of his soul to the outside of his skin, from the tips of his ears to the bottoms of his toes, the raw power red and white and lethal and begging to be used against this villain, tugging at Izuku's very soul to respond, to save. Izuku looked up to the villain to gauge what kind of jump power he would need to reach him, and the chill that rolled down his spine suggested that he had made eye contact with the lizard man, something he was certain of even in spite of the massive spread of grass and park and civilians that spanned between them. The villain had seemed to have a visible reaction to their eye contact, and after recovering he began to float forward, head still pointed directly at Izuku, his gray-green lizard tail whipping behind him as he moved. "Oh God, he's coming for me?" The boy's anxious mind kicked into full throttle, his thoughts blurring together, his heart racing in his throat. 10 seconds until he makes it here, or maybe less. Did he sense one for all activate, and that's what drew him to me? A power-sensing quirk? Izuku tried to move to an area that was more open, had less people, was safer for a paranormal, superhuman fight. There was no ideal spot, so he settled on a patch of grass with a few abandoned picnic blankets. Even as he moved to a new area, the lizard man was still beelining towards him in a flourish of purple miasma. Is his levitation linked to sensing quirks, or does he just have multiple abilities? 5 seconds away, or 3? Slam. The earth trembled as Mirio suddenly landed by Izuku's side, red-white currents of energy playing across his skin in a manner not unlike the arcs in a plasma globe. "I'm back. Mirio, your face?" Izuku gawked and tried to touch the 4-inch gash across Mirio's forehead and eyebrow, but Mirio shooed his hand away. "I hit." Mirio turned and pointed to a high-rise a few blocks away. "That building." "With my face?" "Yeah, I can see that," Izuku said dryly. The wound looked shallow, thankfully, and was hardly bleeding. "What happened to egg in the microwave?" "I think it accidentally became TNT in the microwave. I really tried to tone it down this time, too, it just..." "Heroes?" The villain's sneer cut through their exchange, drawing their attention to him. The kidnapped boy stared at Izuku and Mirio in awe, and then he began squirming with renewed energy. Izuku recognized the look on his face, the sudden zest to his clamor. He was wriggling with excitement, for them, for the heroes. "Just provisional," Mirio replied sheepishly, moving his upturned hands in a seesaw motion to demonstrate the gray truth of the villain's statement, but the villain talked over him. "They told me it wouldn't take much to lure you out," the lizard man said smugly, giving the boy in his arms a rough jostle. "Can't resist the limelight for anything, can you? He has us." "There," Mirio muttered to Izuku out of the corner of his mouth. Izuku shook his head in disapproval of the running commentary, but a smile tugged at his lips in spite of himself. The bulk of the crowd had followed the villain to his new position on the far side of the park. The gaggle of 30 to 50 civilians were still clamoring, still shouting, still distressed, but they weren't emboldened enough to confront the villain in the way that Mirio did when he pointed a finger at the villain and yelled, "Listen up, fiend." Izuku watched the sunlight catch on the face of his friend, watched the way Mirio's authoritative and booming voice caused the crowd to perk up, watched the way that Mirio's face lit in a smile. He was the embodiment of cool, collected, and in charge. And he was the current holder of One for All. "You get one chance to do this peacefully," Mirio declared. "Hand over the boy, and you'll go to jail with those pretty little teeth of yours still in your face. You harm a single hair on his head, and you get to enjoy veneers for the rest of your days." Mirio lowered his voice almost to a whisper and turned his head towards Izuku. "Remember that whole de-escalation through demoralization thing I told you to practice? You got anything to add?" He made a grand gesture to Izuku with his hand. The crowd turned to stare at him expectantly, and Izuku blanched a little before pulling his spine ramrod straight, his lips drawn into a tight, nervous line. He shot Mirio a miserable look. The knowing look Mirio returned to him suggested that this push into the limelight was very deliberate. "I can do this." Izuku swallowed strong, his chin high. And he tried to shout, but his voice cracked, and so he tried again, "And then we will find out if you have caudal autotomy, or if you will suffer non-regenerative tail loss." Mirio turned to stare at him with his face drawn so tightly together that he probably couldn't even see Izuku, and even the crowd shared in a low, uncertain murmur at his words. "We'll keep working on that," Mirio assured him quietly, clearing his throat and then turning to the villain again with a yell. "So what'll it be, villain? Will you surrender to the heroes?" The villain scoffed. "Idiots." He shook his head, looking off to the side for a long moment, and then he pulled his cloak down to reveal his face. Izuku and Mirio observed a lizard head covered in a spread of tough, bumpy skin. The villain's eyes were mustard yellow, and in their center were the thin, vertical slashes of reptilian pupils, a black line in a pool of goldenrod that now flitted bitterly between the two boys. "This isn't about villains and heroes. This is about you two and what you did to the Shie Hassaikai." Izuku tensed and snapped his gaze to Mirio's, who looked back at him with equal consternation. "You're right," Izuku said boldly, his heart hammering in his Ihian throat. "This is between us and you, so let the child go." The villain regarded him quietly, and then barked out a single laugh. "Can't. Who else would I use this on?" From the innards of his cloak, the lizard man produced a clear glass orb about the size of a softball. Inside, there was a tiny purple flame. "No!" Izuku yelled at the same moment that Mirio launched forward, one for all exploding under his heels like the burst of a grenade, rocketing him towards the villain. The villain shot out a hand and Mirio was frozen midair by the same purple miasma that held the villain aloft. Mirio retched out loud like he had just slammed into a brick wall. The crowd gasped and yelled. "Too late, heroes. If you wanted to preserve human life, you shouldn't have meddled where you didn't belong." The villain slammed the glass orb into the CST of the boy, who shrieked in pain, and an explosion of white light swallowed up the entire public park, blinding all who stood in the area. A wicked, shrill laugh filled the ears of the gathered crowd. "Let me show you what your so-called act of justice has cost." "Izuku!" Mirio's voice was strained, as though the purple energy holding him was causing him pain. "You've got to do this." Izuku blinked open his eyes as the light faded. The boy was gone. Instead, before Izuku stood a towering monster 8 or 9 feet tall, with 8 gnarled limbs, 4 on the ground, and 4 unfurling from the torso of this beast in a grotesque, inhuman fashion. Massive fangs gnashed together and the beast hissed with a ferocity that shook the earth. "A spider monster!" The crowd stumbled away, shrieking and shoving. Izuku saw one woman standing like a stone in the river of people who rushed around her. She clutched a blue stuffed bear to her knee, watching the spider beast in horror. With a guttural screech, the monster lunged at Izuku, its 4 spider legs punching through the concrete like it was mud. Izuku felt the remnants of one for all simmering in his core, pushing up, up, up into his limbs like a pot of water on the stove boiling over. The power surged into his fists, his feet, his face. Save, 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 that sensation spoke into his skull, into his bones. Izuku launched into the air, towards the villains, though he stared at the mother of the boy as he roared, "Detroit smash!" 2 months earlier. It was the middle of December, which meant that Mizudafu's street lamps kicked on a little earlier with every day that passed. The setting sun painted the white hallways of the hospital step-down unit a palette of pastel yellows and ambers. It was chilly outside, but not so cold that Izuku felt the need to dress in additional layers when he left campus, opting to stay in his school uniform so that he could leave as soon as his classes ended. Now, the green-haired boy moved down the hospital corridor, an eye on the placards above each door as he looked for the one his friend was in. The Shie Hassaikai raid had been carried out 2 days ago, a mission that had been planned and executed by a task force made up of the local police, various pro-heroes and their agencies, and a handful of UA high school students whose quirks and skills had been deemed advantageous to the completion of the mission. The raid was completed with the primary objectives being met. The main target, a man named Kai Chisaki, alias Overhaul, had been arrested. The child hostage, Eri, had been rescued. Many of the members of the Shie Hassaikai had been detained for questioning. The mission hadn't been completed without serious ramifications, however. Many people were injured, heroes, students, police, and villains, which was something the task force had hoped to avoid. There had even been a death. Izuku winced at the fresh memory of Mirai Sasaki laying like a statue in his hospital bed, his skin as pale as the sheets that covered his lifeless body. Izuku shoved that memory away. He was here to bring positivity, not to dampen the mood of those students still recovering. The one student still recovering. Izuku had been told that most of the UA high school students hospitalized 2 days ago were already discharged, leaving just one. Izuku paused in the doorway as he turned into Mirio Togata's room, watching as he performed what could best be described as a candlestick bicycle kick combo. He couldn't tell if Mirio was restless from bedrest or if this was just one of his usual whims, but it made him smile, and also fuss at the older boy, considering how extreme his injuries had been. As he stepped close enough to share a casual chat, Izuku felt the air get cooler. Mirio had cracked open the bedside window just enough to let the occasional winter breeze creep in and stir up the stagnant air of the hospital room. The acrid tang of hospital cleaner stung Izuku's nose, but underneath it, he caught a faint hint of decaying leaves drifting in from the parted window. He frowned. This room felt too small, too cold, too dark for somebody as warm and larger-than-life as Mirio. It wasn't right. Mirio explained that his physician promised he'd be discharged tomorrow if he continued to show improvement. As they talked, Mirio laughed a couple of times, lilting and warm. Then, in the middle of one of his giggles, Izuku watched as his face fell and his shoulders sagged. He felt a jolt of concern as Mirio leaned forward in his hospital bed, navy blue eyes focused on something beyond the wall that only he could see. "I know I've lost my quirk, and my mentor has passed away," Mirio said, speaking slowly, gravely. "I shouldn't be in a laughing state of mind. But that's why I do it." His gaze drifted to what lay beyond the window, and Izuku followed it. Outside the hospital, bare trees reached into the gray sky like a sea of brittle brown fingers. Sir Night-Eye used to tell me that a society without cheer and humor won't have a bright future. Izuku's gaze fell to his shoes at the mention of the deceased hero. Mirai had also said that Izuku was completely ordinary, underwhelming and average in a way that his super strength alone wasn't enough to compensate for, and that Toshinori should have chosen Mirio to inherit one for all instead of Izuku. It was true back then in Mirai's office, and it was still true at Mirio's bedside. Mirio embodied everything that Izuku lacked. As these thoughts ran through his head, Izuku felt a familiar pull, the kind he had felt so many times before, the kind where his body just moved on its own, and suddenly his mouth was open and words were tumbling out. "Even when your quirk was taken away, you still kept protecting Eri by yourself, with no powers at all, didn't you?" Mirio turned his head, staring at Izuku with a cross between interest and suspicion. "Compared to that, I was supposed to protect Eri in that raid, but I ended up needing her help, and also Mr. Aizawa's." Izuku couldn't stop the barrage of self-deprecating thoughts that poured into his mind like water into a fishbowl, threatening to overflow and spill from his stinging eyes. What if his originally quirkless body, unevolved in the way that those born with quirks had evolved, was holding One for All back? What would happen if One for All was given to someone with not just the longing, but the extraordinary character and confident spirit to become the next symbol of peace? "What are you saying, Izuku?" Mirio's voice was gentle, but his furrowed brow betrayed his wariness. "If you'd been the successor, then Sir Night-Eye might, and All Might's future, too." Izuku's mind jumped to the grim look on Toshinori's face when he revealed that Mirai had predicted his death, insisting that nobody could defy the futures that Mirai used his future sight quirk to scry. Izuku took a step towards Mirio, emboldened, his next words earnest and imploring. "If I said I could give my quirk to you, then would you take it?" Silence fell between the two boys. Mirio finally laughed, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Even if you could, wouldn't that cause you trouble? And it wouldn't bring back Sir Night-Eye." As Mirio spoke, Izuku realized he could hear something. A whisper? He felt it brush against the insides of his ears like the murmur of a wave against sand. He tried to focus on it, single it out from the sounds of the hospital, from Mirio's voice. Indeed, he could hear just the faintest shimmer of a voice, but even as he strained, he couldn't make any of its words out. Mirio shifted to fully face Izuku, his tone sympathetic. "I know this isn't the outcome that any of us wanted, Midoriya, but the best thing we can do right now, for ourselves, for each other, for Eri, for Sir Nitai's sacrifice, is go forward. And for me, Mirio let out a gentle sigh, his next words heavy with an ache that the once quirkless Izuku knew so intimately that it struck him to the core. For me, going forward means heading into whatever comes next without a quirk. Quirkless, Izuku's mind supplied bitterly. Mirio Togata, one of the big three, was going to be quirkless now. Mirio's face suddenly brightened. Actually, Mr. Aizawa did say that, with extensive training, Eri might be able to bring it back someday with her reversal power, but he clicked his tongue. Well, just in case she can't, I think I'd better start getting used to life without a quirk. Like they say, prepare for the worst and hope for the best, right? No, Izuku objected sharply, stepping even closer to Mirio, his knuckles clenched so tightly that they ached. Of course, Mirio couldn't grasp what Izuku was trying to tell him about inheriting one for all, but there was so much he wanted to say and explain, all at once, that his words came out in a patchwork of half-formed, urgent sentences. I want to give you my quirk. I can give you my quirk. You were supposed to get my quirk. The whisper in his ears had grown more insistent, and it was now pressing on his ear with a direness that made his heart begin to race, but he wasn't sure what it meant, what the voice wanted, what it was even saying. It was obvious that Mirio couldn't hear it. What is this? Izuku's eyes darted around the room, back at the door, out the window, but he and Mirio were the only ones here. What was happening? What was he hearing? Mirio stared at him, his eyes narrowed like he was trying to piece together Izuku's words and actions. A smile began to form on his face as though he were about to crack a joke, but then his expression grew serious again. Midoriya, what are you talking about? Izuku stared up at the ceiling. He realized now that it wasn't one, but many voices in his ears. Yes, he could hear many different whispers woven into the pounding of his pulse in his ears, but he couldn't make out what any one voice was saying. He held his breath, trying desperately to listen. The voices all spoke over one another, but they were just quiet enough to be indecipherable. These are the voices of one for all, he realized, a chill running down his spine. He couldn't determine if their whispers were cautious or excited, if they were displeased by what he was offering to Mirio or if they were delighted by his suggestion. Because he couldn't hear any clear signs of opposition from the hushed voices, he continued tentatively, looking again to Mirio's face. I have a special quirk. And, originally, it was supposed to belong to you, Togata. Izuku stayed with Mirio late into the evening, long after the setting sun had plunged the city into darkness and long after the hospital visiting hours had ended. Their conversation was quiet and urgent, an attempt to define the impossible and piece together what might happen next. Mirio was reluctant, but Izuku felt strongly. Mirio should inherit one for all, at least until his own quirk returned. Neither of them had reached any kind of conclusion on the logistics of this idea when a sharp knock on the door halted their discussion. Mirio's nurse told Izuku that he had stayed long enough, and reluctantly, with a last long look at Mirio, he rose to leave. When Izuku stepped into the crisp December air, his thoughts rolled around in his head with the same heaviness and unease as an imminent thunderstorm. Izuku knew deep down that this conversation had set something irreversible into motion. Whatever came next, for better or for worse, there was no turning back. Is this the right decision? Somewhere in the outskirts of Mustafu, there was not a single street lamp to cleave through the dark of night that had settled over the industrial complex like a spill of black ink. A half-collapsed warehouse loomed over the skeletal remains of the dilapidated buildings that were scattered around it like a strew of carcasses. Around it, a crowd had begun to gather, though they were careful to keep their distance from both the structure and one another, remaining discreet as they waited for their turn to approach a small egress door around the back of the building. This entrance was guarded by a cloaked figure, who bowed and exchanged low words with each visitor before allowing them to pass. Inside, warped sheets of metal hung off the walls like peeling scabs, and graffiti marked various pieces of abandoned machinery and some of the larger areas of remaining sheet wall. A sparse trickle of moonlight offered the figures inside little visual aid as they picked their way around the debris that spanned the majority of the floor space. They moved with purpose towards a central area in the warehouse, an area that was tucked away from the worst of the elements and thus in moderately better condition. Here, there were a few administrative offices that were mostly intact, and inside some 20-odd people had gathered already, with more trickling in by the minute. "Could we get lights, please?" A voice cut through the darkness, not particularly loud but carrying an undeniable weight of importance over those gathered. A shaggy-haired man on the far side of the office pushed himself off the wall where he'd been slouching and moved toward the circuit panel. He laid his palm on the breaker box, sending a surge of electricity that brought half of the room's fluorescent lights to life, casting a flickering white light over the crowd while humming low like a sea of exhausted flies. At the head of the crowd stood a lean man with slicked back, dark hair. He concealed the lower half of his face behind a plain mask, and he wore a white robe with a unique emblem sewn onto its BRC, an emblem decipherable only to knowing eyes that signaled his identity and affiliation, Escalating of the Shie Hassaikai. "Let's start with the part that I know you're all most anxious to hear," Escalating said. His voice wasn't particularly loud and his demeanor wasn't particularly assertive, yet the gathered quieted with an obvious respect for his authority. "We still don't have any updates on Overhaul." Distressed murmurs rippled through the crowd. "All that we have right now is that he is still in Tartarus prison. We have not been able to make any kind of contact with him yet. Have we heard anything from any of the other 8 bullets?" The woman who asked this question went by the name Rosetta. She wore a cherry-red cocktail dress and pearls, and she moved toward Hekiji with the poised grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "No, not yet," Escalating responded grimly. "Arakumo has been working on that." Roused by the mention of his name, a figure stirred from the shadows in one of the far corners of the room. He unfurled slowly, rising to a height multiple feet above even the tallest of those in the crowd on 4 gnarled spider legs. Most of his features were masked in the darkness he sheltered in, but the silhouette of his face was broken by 2 massive, chitinous spider fangs. Through the shadows, for small and beady black eyes glistened above his brow, unblinking, unnerving. "I've identified a couple of janitors who will potentially be weak links in Tartarus." Arakumo's voice was harsh, like oil sizzling in a pan, and the final "us" in Tartarus was elongated, drawn out like the hiss of a snake. "I suspect they will be willing to serve our interests for the right price." One person scoffed. A handful near the back muttered dubiously to one another. "With what money?" The voice that spoke up was young, sounding almost like a woman's, but it actually belonged to a 19-year-old named Ayashimin Hamada, who commonly went by Aya. The boy had high cheekbones, a gentle jaw that sloped roundly into his chin, long pale eyelashes, and sloppy bun of strawberry blonde hair that was obviously well cared for. "Where's the part where those of us without homes get somewhere to sleep and shower?" "Agreed." The growl came from a huge, tanned man with gelled-up black hair and a salt-and-pepper beard. He was in his mid-40s, and his muscled arms were as thick around as logs. He was unabashed about his role as a third-generation Yakuza member, and he only allowed people to refer to him by his villain name, Rough Rider. "Most of our funds have been frozen by the police, and our contracts won't pay us right now. I'm not sleeping on another fucking park bench." Contracts were what the Shie Hassaikai called the local families and businesses that they had financial affiliations with. The Shie Hassaikai offered these contracts typical Yakuza services: intimidating rival businesses, providing security where police presence was not ideal, hand-delivering sensitive items, collecting unpaid debts, handling troublemakers, and offering high-interest loans. Each one of their contracts had distanced themselves after the raid to avoid police scrutiny, cutting off vital income. "We are doing our best to find shelter," Arakumo told the man. "Every one of us is on the streets right now. Our next order of business after this meeting is to secure a safe location to put everyone." The crowd's sour mood and visible exhaustion weighed heavily on Hekiji. He had never expected to be moved into the role of Shie Hassaikai leader, but he had been the only one of the 8 bullets to escape police custody. Hekiji was generally a man of few words, but he knew that it was his duty alone to rally the remaining members if they were to survive, so he forced himself to speak. "We all have doubts about the future, especially me, if I'm being honest." Hekiji knew that most of these people didn't trust him. Unlike them, he hadn't been born into the Yakuza group. In fact, Most of them outright resented him for being elevated by Kai to a higher rank than them, as he had none of the years of service that they did. This raid is the worst blow the group has ever endured, and the future looks bleak. If we are to survive, you must understand this. Restoring our contracts? No, restoring the Shie Hassaikai is going to depend on trust and unity. I know I haven't earned it, but I humbly ask that you give me your cooperation and strong work as we move forward. He motioned for Arakumo to join him at the head of the crowd, but the man seemed reluctant to leave the corner. Please lend Arakumo your ears as he presents the plan we've prepared. Long as the spider freak doesn't crawl into someone muttered. Our plan has two parts. Arakumo's words quieted the scattered chuckles. As he considered how to continue, his fangs clicked together a couple of times, an action that had yet to be deciphered as deliberate or purely animal. First, we will use the quirk reversal bullets that are still in our possession to erase the powers of professional heroes with important roles in society. We will offer the return of their quirks in exchange for what we need. For the people we need. You're kidding, right? Target and erase the quirks of important pro-heroes? Rough Rider spoke up. Before Arakumo had fully finished. We'd have the feds, police, every hero and their freaking mothers on our butt. That's way too risky right now. He drummed his fingers on his bicep, shaking his head as if wrestling with Arakumo's words. There's just no way. If the public knew we still had quirk reversal power, they'd freak and the police wouldn't stop until every last one of us was locked up. Right now, they think they've contained the biggest threat from the Shie Hassaikai. Let's not ruin that. All 6 of Arakumo's eyes were locked on Rough Rider. The Shie Hassaikai has played it careful for too long, Rider. That ends now. Dire straits call for big risks. Arakumo intentionally talked over the man's negative rebuttal as he continued. The second part of our plan is to restore our income. The fastest, cheapest way to repair our reputation with our contracts would be through retaliation. Retaliation against who, exactly? A second woman interjected. The police? The pro-heroes? You know we just lost to them, right? This woman's green eyes were dark with a chilling sobriety. Her name was Amei Endo and she, like Rough Rider, had been born into the Shie Hassaikai. She had raven black hair, parted at the temple and swept over the top of her head, contrasting with a shaved lower half. She was in her late 30s and a silver septum piercing glinted beneath her nose. We shouldn't be doing anything other than trying to not get arrested. I mean, for FS sake, Tingai is at the top of the police's most wanted list right now for that little escape from custody stunt he pulled on the way to the station. She made a choppy, frustrated gesture towards Hikiji. You couldn't even go and sneeze in Narahata right now without attracting a swarm of feds and heroes. How are we supposed to do anything against anyone, as small and weak as we are right now? Not all who participated in the raid were as strong as the others. Hikiji said simply. Some were weaker, younger. He stopped to brace himself for the stir he knew his next words would cause. There were UA high school students there. Indeed, the crowd bristled. Oh yeah, kids. Wow, that's really fantastic. Amei clapped a few times, then raised her hands repeatedly as though hyping a crowd at a concert. Come on, everyone, let's go attack some children. I'm sure when the boss wakes up from his coma, he'll be thrilled to learn that this is how we've been spending our time. Her enthusiastic, airy tone was thick with sarcasm. Hikiji Tengai stiffened at her outburst, but he didn't speak. Attacking UA high students seemed mild compared to what Kai had done to Eri. Kai had deliberately kept details of Eri and her role in his grand plan a secret from the majority of the Shie Hassaikai, as he had anticipated that the majority of its members would have strong and negative reactions to the abuse he had subjected the boss's granddaughter to. When Kai announced that he'd isolated and produced ingredients for the quirk reversal bullets by working with the sharpest of the Shie Hassaikai minds and their quirks, few had questioned it. Hikiji had no intention of sharing the truth about Eri with the group, as it would certainly drive an even deeper wedge between the remaining members. Most members dabbled on the wrong side of the law, but they were not downright criminals, as Amei was insinuating. We wouldn't survive the backlash of the police and pro-heroes did if we killed UA students like that. A third woman added, her eyes narrowed. This woman was named Koyuki Suzuki, and her black skin was covered in white, glowing tattoos that moved with the slow, sweeping grace of an aurora borealis. Arakumo stepped out from his corner, emerging into the light all at once like a nightmare conjured up from the shadows. He didn't need to ask for the crowd to practically leap out of the way of his long, grotesque legs. This isn't about slaughter. This is about fear. If those heroes see that we still have the power to strip them bare, they'll remember what the Shie Hassaikai stands for. The spider-adjacent human tapped on a device strapped to his wrist, and suddenly, a bright green-white light poured out of it, projecting holographic images of 6 miniature figures on the floor. These were the students who had participated in the Shie Hassaikai raid. Murmurs rippled through the audience as several recognized at least one of the faces being projected. Killing children isn't the goal, but let's not pretend that the Shie Hassaikai has clean hands. Arakumo didn't look up from where he was still messing with hologram settings on the device he wore. The Shie Hassaikai was never known for its purity. It's about sending a message, especially to our contracts, Hikiji said quickly, hoping his reminder would quell any anger that Arakumo's words may have roused in the audience. Any harm caused in the process isn't intentional, it's simply a necessary outcome for our survival. Yeah, necessary outcome, woo. Let's all get together and F up some kids. Ame spoke again, louder, punching her fist into the other palm like she was threatening to beat somebody up. We're the Shie Hassaikai, known for hurting people who can't defend themselves to make some money. Isn't that right? 'Cause that's what Arakumo and Tingai said. She tried to search for sympathy in the faces of the people around her, but many of them looked away. Her voice grew malicious. Nobody else here has an issue with this? Would you get off that high horse of yours? We are talking about children who are being trained to kill us, Rosetta hissed, marching towards her. Ame glared, but didn't back down as Rosetta shoved her face into Ame's. We'd be smart to take them, their quirks, out of the picture while they're still small and weak enough that we even have a chance to do so. The quirk-reversing bullet on its own can't kill them or anything. They just need to be good little brats and not fight us about it, and they won't get hurt. The woman tossed her head towards Arakumo. I'm on board. Wait, what if we combined both parts of your plan? Ayashimin's voice was almost lost from behind the bodies of Rough Rider and Koyuki. He was the smallest in the crowd and needed to weave around every single person there to get a good look at the holograms. He looked them over and then turned to Hikiji. We could use our last quirk-reversing bullets on these students, instead of on pro-heroes. Targets that are less high-profile. We already used one in the raid, right? And it worked. Correct, Arakumo supplied cautiously. The student by the name of Mirio Togata lost his quirk. It was the first successful field use of a quirk reversal bullet, so we already have at least some leverage to use with the police. Then? Ayashimin pushed. This student's quirk? Yes. Hikiji looked pleased by the young boy's suggestion. Yes. We could potentially begin to bargain with the quirk we've already taken. We likely won't be able to bargain for the return of Overhaul in exchange for the quirk of one high schooler, Arakumo warned. We'd be fortunate to see even so much as one of the other 8 bullets released for someone so insignificant. But his fangs clicked together as he processed the possibilities that lay ahead of them. Perhaps if we stole multiple quirks, even if we stick to Aya's suggestion and take them exclusively from students, perhaps we'd be able to ask for more. I'm sure I don't need to remind you of how important it is that we see to the return of our biology. Specialists if we want to make any more quirk reversal bullets? Combining a mass quirk reversal operation with retaliation, Koyuki murmured while tapping a black acrylic nail on her chin. Can we define what retaliation means, exactly? I, for one, happen to like the idea of retaliation. Rosetta's lips, painted in the same rich shade as her dress, curled up in a morbid pleasure. I personally can't wait to get to the part where we squash those twerps in the League of Villains like the bugs that they are. She glanced at Arakumo. No offense, dear. Arakumo simply clacked his fangs in reply. You want to pick another fight with the League of Villains? Ame's face grew horrified. We all saw those images being circulated around about what that shithead did to Overhaul's arms. You think we could survive that kind of quirk right now? That we could survive that psychopath right now? We haven't gotten proof that those pictures are real. Rosetta's words were tight, defensive. And we haven't gotten proof that they're fake either? Amei snapped. It isn't like we've heard from Overhaul himself on the matter. As Arakumo said, we are extremely low on options. Hikiji's voice was harsh in a way that made both women gawk at the white-robed man, whose eyes blazed with anger. And, as I said already, cooperation is the only chance we have at survival. Amei groaned in frustration, rubbing her forehead with a hand. So, just so we're all clear, your grand plan is that we'll take some quirks from some kids, beat them up while they can't fight back for our retaliation, and then hope that we even have enough antidote bullets for all the quirk reversing we did so that we can trade all the baseball cards we want with the cops? Her words dripped with malice. That sounds just great, doesn't it? She stared at the floor with her jaw clenched, then said in a voice that was as sharp as a knife's edge, and we had thought Overhaul was a sheet leader. Her comment was met by a long, tense silence. When Hekiji spoke, it wasn't with the sharp tone he'd used moments before. With deliberate calmness, he said slowly, I want to take this opportunity to repeat what I have shared with you all last night. Hekiji knew that Amei had always been strongly opposed to Kai's add-ons. There was likely nothing he could say or do as a leader that would please her, and there was no plan he could create that she would agree with. It was probable that they would never see eye to eye on anything they did going forward. While usually members who abandon the Shie Hassaikai are to be hunted down and executed, this is not our normal group, I am not our normal leader, and these are not normal circumstances. Things will get worse before they get better. Hekiji stared at Amei through slitted eyes as he finished. Any member who wishes to leave, or who doubts my leadership, is welcome to go. You will not be harassed for your decision, now or in the future. You have my word. Amei's fists bunched at her sides and her face contorted with hurt. Her teeth heaved with rage as she ground out through clenched teeth. You offer the choice to leave behind something that is our family legacy so casually, as if that is an easy decision for any of us to make. We didn't ask for you to become our leader. Rough Rider suddenly waved a hand high in the air, like a dismissive throw of a ball. Well, it was easy enough for me. This group has dominated Narahata for 4 DMN generations and it's come to this. Fucking said. He moved to exit the room, only pausing in the doorway to say over his shoulder, this isn't the same Shie Hassaikai my family has served for 40 years. We're a Yakuza group, not a terrorist organization. And he was gone. Amei had started to follow him, but she stopped to spare a forlorn look at Hekiji. The boss would be rolling in his hospital bed if he knew what you were about to do, Huting. Then she crossed through the door to... The exodus hadn't ended. A couple of members from the back of the crowd took their leaves, their eyes scarcely leaving the floor as they did. Finally, after almost a minute, one last person sighed and left. Though some of the crowd seemed visibly uncomfortable, they were clearly set on staying. While Hekiji knew it was largely due to their loyalty to the Shie Hassaikai and not remotely because of him, he was still overcome with gratitude and humility, and he bowed low to the men and women who stood before him. I am going to give you my very best effort and guidance these coming weeks, I promise you. Once we are in a better place, stronger and safe, I will reward your loyalty and strong work. Hekiji straightened himself, and a surge of determination filled his ear. There is a lot of planning we must do to move forward. It will not be as swift or as easy of a process as some of you may be hoping. Arakumo had much less patience than Hekiji, and his stress with the way that the meeting had gone was evident in his seething tone. I'm sure we all know this, but the UA campus is in Mustafu. That's where we'll start. Hekiji couldn't get the look that had been on Amei's face, her distraught tone of voice, out of his head. I want to reiterate, our mission isn't to harm children. This is about getting bargaining chips with the police, and about restoring the confidence of our contracts. I've already spoken with some of them. They just need proof that we can still deliver results after the recent events. The air that hung over the remaining crowd was uneasy, sour. Rosetta. Hekiji looked to the elegantly attired woman. Your stealth is almost unrivaled and I need your sharp eye. I'm putting you in charge of scoping out these 6 students. I want to know their schedules, the school layout, their friends, their family members. I need you to probe into their campus to find how we can get in. We will need information before we can make any decisive plans. I don't have any particular targets in mind, It will boil down to who is the easiest and safest. You've got it, boss man. Rosetta bowed with great flourish and a pleased little smile. Suzuki, surveillance by police is our greatest threat right now. I need you to put together a team to run counter-surveillance. We need to remain undetected, and we need an idea of what the police are up to. We would not survive a second raid, and we cannot risk infiltration. Can you handle this? I can, Kuoki returned coolly. Her tattoos seemed to glow a little brighter as she considered the weight of the task she had just been given. Meduso, Aya. You both did very good with this location for our meeting, but I need you to continue to find more options. This one is too close to our last one. I don't think it would take long for the police to sniff us out here. Why don't you look for something on the other side of Mustafu? Roger, Ayashimine called, hooking an arm around his friend's shoulders. Meduso was the only other teenager in their crowd, a boy with unruly black hair and a pair of sunglasses on his face. He didn't speak and he didn't look up as Ayashimine beamed and said, "You can count on us. For those of you who remain, begin to prepare." Hikiji's face grew grim as he imagined the hardship ahead of them. I can't promise that we will attain the outcome we want, but I'll be dead if I let what's left of the Shie Hassaikai be swept away without a fight. He didn't need to spell out the reality they all understood. The recovery from the raid was going to be perilous, and each step forward would carry the weight of potential ruin. Yet, as they stood together in that crumbling and frigid warehouse, those who remained shared a singular conviction. It was far better to fight and risk destruction than to be swept into irrelevance. The legacy of the Shie Hassaikai would not fall quietly into oblivion. The air in the teacher's lounge lay solemn between Izuku and Tashinori. The low white sofa Izuku occupied and the stout black coffee table between them had become familiar fixtures, mute witnesses to the talks they shared so often in this room. Izuku had been relieved, as always, that there hadn't been anybody in the hallways or lounge when they met. Explaining their business together without revealing their secret would have been impossible. Tashinori leaned forward on the opposite couch, his elbows on his thighs and chin resting on folded hands. Izuku could take a guess at what might be going through his head: confusion, frustration, maybe even a sense of betrayal. The thought made Izuku's heart ache, but he tore his eyes away, focusing on the spacious room instead. The array of comfortable-looking couches, orderly filing cabinets, and well-cared-for potted plants seemed jarringly calm compared to the storm of tension hanging between them. He almost jumped when Tashinori spoke again. "You suppose," Tashinori said, low and wary, with a look on his face that hovered on the edge of being a grimace, "that, yes, you could potentially pass one for all on to young Togata?" His mentor's face held a deep unease, and Izuku searched carefully, as though he could identify its source in the furrow of his brow or tightening of his jaw. Tashinori refused to meet his eyes. Instead, he stared at the bookcases behind Izuku, his brow knit as he tapped his tented index fingers together in a slow, pensive rhythm. "I think that one for all would be in better hands," Izuku replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "Togata has so many qualities that I don't, all might. And now that he lost his quirk, this feels like the right decision. Please understand." Another stretch of silence settled over the lounge. The ticking of a nearby clock grew louder in the stillness. At last, Tashinori leaned back on the sofa, pressing his palms flat onto his thighs. "Young Midoriya?" Izuku watched his mentor closely, desperate to catch every flicker of Tashinori's expression, every shift in his posture, anything to clue him in to what words were coming. "I chose you, specifically, to inherit this power," Tashinori said slowly, "because I believed that you, more than anyone else I had ever met, would wield it for good." Tashinori waited for those words to sink in before he continued, his gaze unwavering. "You have a good heart, young Midoriya. You've always been willing to learn and grow, from your instructors, your classmates, your shortcomings, and even your successes. You are kind. You are just—" Tashinori extended a finger toward Izuku, his words certain. "These qualities make you the perfect wielder for One for All." The praise that his childhood idol was heaping on him left Izuku unsure of how to respond, so attempted the cool composure that he imagined Tashinori himself would display in this situation. Of course, The effort was surely undermined by the unmistakable flush spreading across his cheeks and ears. I was certain that you were the right choice to inherit one for all when I watched you put your life before young Bakugo's 8 months ago. Toshinori's eyes locked onto Izuku's with an intensity that pierced right through his facade of confidence, making him feel very small and exposed. I'm confident that you are on track to become Japan's next symbol of peace. On the other hand, I don't know young Togata, and I don't have the same confidence in his ability to carry this quirk. While pleasure fluttered in Izuku's eye at the continued praise, at the weight of his mentor's prediction, it was quickly washed away by a crushing wave of guilt. This isn't about me thinking you made the wrong choice, All Might, because I trust you. I've always trusted you. Izuku's voice grew tight, strained with his desperation to make Toshinori to understand. But now that Togata has lost his quirk, it feels like it has to happen. From the moment it had happened, Izuku had desperately wanted to tell his mentor about the phenomenon he experienced in the hospital 3 days ago, when multiple voices had filled his ears. But every time he had tried to imagine how the conversation with Toshinori might go, the words slipped away. How could he possibly explain the indescribable swell of whispers that had filled his mind when he offered to pass one for all to Mirio? Just thinking about telling Toshinori he was hearing the voices made his stomach drop, because what person would take that seriously? Since that day, any time that he genuinely thought about giving his quirk to his upperclassmen again, those voices returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed extremely sensitive to the idea of being passed on to Mirio, and their whispers felt meaningful to Izuku, for better or for worse. I feel like the quirk wants it. Izuku stared at his hands and nervously picked at a peel of skin on one of his cuticles. Like it's telling me to do this. Silence. Izuku couldn't bring himself to meet Toshinori's eyes, unwilling to face his mentor as he sifted through everything Izuku had just unloaded. Did Sir Night Eye say something to you during your internship? Izuku stiffened and his fists clenched on his lap. He tried to collect himself, but after a moment he slumped back into his seat, knowing that he had already given himself away. It told me you two had discussed Togata. Passing one for all on to him. Toshinori waited, but Izuku couldn't continue. How could he tell his mentor, his lifelong idol, that the faith Toshinori had placed in him had been dismissed as a mistake by Mirai, his longtime pupil and former sidekick? What? He did want that. One for all to go to young Togata, Toshinori's gaze drifted past Izuku once again, as though he could see his past hidden in the spines of the textbooks that lined the shelves behind him. Our relationship grew strained because of my choice to pass it to you instead. He paused, his expression softening, and then he closed his eyes for a few seconds, the grief of Mirai's loss obviously still raw. We didn't part on bad terms. Up until the end, we remained professional, still checked in on each other. Still cared. It's just, my decision to give you one for all was one choice in a long series of many that Mirai saw as self-destructive. It became too much for him. He couldn't stay close to me, caring about me as much as he did, and continue to watch me make decisions he believed were wrong. Harmful. Wrong. Harmful. Izuku's inheritance of one for all had driven a wedge between his mentor and his sidekick. A fresh wave of guilt crashed over him, heavy and cold, and he hung his head. All he had ever wanted was to do good, to become a hero, and yet it had come at such a steep consequence, one he hadn't even known about until now. One of the greatest hero-sidekick pairs to exist had been torn apart, and he was the reason. None of this is your fault, young Midoriya. Please don't look so gloomy, Toshinori urged, his face softening as he regarded his pupil. There's something else. Something that Sir Night Eye couldn't have understood, because he didn't have one for all. Gritting his teeth, Izuku looked up at Toshinori. Feeling less gloomy about the hero-sidekick partnership he'd inadvertently fractured, one that hadn't mended before Mirai's passing, was easier said than done. One for all. Like a person in a way, Toshinori began, folding his arms as he searched for the right words. Or, actually, it's like many people? He squinted and then grunted. Sorry. I'm not sure how to explain it properly, but it communicates, sometimes. It rarely ever happened to me, he added quickly, but you've experienced it before, The incident at the sports festival, it sounded like you saw the previous wielders of the quirk, didn't you? Izuku nodded and the memory surfaced, the moment the previous wielders had appeared to him as glowing, ethereal vestiges during the sports festival. For as rarely as the quirk spoke to me, when I watched you save young Bakugo, I heard it. Tashinori exhaled slowly. It didn't speak words, exactly. I just heard it. The voices of the previous wielders. Izuku nearly toppled off the edge of the couch. You heard what? He'd heard Tashinori's words just fine, but he needed to hear them again, to know that his mentor had experienced what he had. I know it sounds a little odd, but when I saw you leap into action to save your friend that day, I could hear voices. Voices that belonged to the previous wielders of the quirk. You heard them? Tashinori shook his head. I know how this sounds. Let me start over. As he waited for his mentor to collect his thoughts, Izuku tried to calm his breathing. He really heard the same voices as me. That day the sludge villain attacked young Bakugo. It was witnessed by a crowd full of people with powers that could have stood a chance against that villain. And yet, it was you, the boy without a quirk, who rushed in to help. That kind of bravery, it was truly something to see. A smile tugged at Tashinori's lips, and Izuku almost smiled too. He pushed those feelings aside, forcing himself to focus on Tashinori's words as he continued, and that's when I heard them. Those voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying, exactly, but they were loud in my ears. They wanted me to pass it on to you. Izuku's fists tightened as he stared at his mentor, unblinking. They seemed to know before I did that you would be the next to wield one for all. Tashinori looked a little amused at this idea, but the serious look he'd been wearing was quick to return to his face. I did hear a lot about young Togata before I met you. Sir Knight, I always had glowing praise when it came to the boy. He would often show me videos from their missions. He kept detailed portfolios of his work studies to help them get hired at pro agencies later on, if they didn't just join his own agency. So, I saw young Togata's work. It wasn't bad. Not wanting to rush Tashinori, Izuku didn't speak, but he was desperate to hear more about the voices that Tashinori had heard, that they'd both heard. One time I even shook young Togata's hand, but I never heard those voices. Tashinori lay his hands in his lap, his expression distant. And then I saw you, and I heard how excited the quirk became when it witnessed you rush in to save your friend. That's when I knew I had to choose you. It had nothing to do with Sir Night Eye or his judgment. Tashinori fell silent, his gaze fixed on his hands. Young Togata would have been a fine choice, certainly, but that wasn't who One for All wanted right then. The quirk wanted you. He couldn't keep his hands from trembling as Izuku said, and now it's Togata. Tashinori drew a deep breath in through his nose and then let it out slowly through his mouth. Young Midoriya, he started gently, but Izuku cut him off. No, Izuku said, leaning forward, his own voice quivering with urgency. I heard them. I heard the voices of the previous quirk wielders, too, All Might. I was speaking to Togata about how he'd lost his quirk, and then it started. It felt so real, but I couldn't understand a single word that they were saying. Tashinori's mouth fell open slightly as he processed this information, but before he could reply, a knock sounded at the door. A glance at his phone told Izuku it was 15 minutes earlier than the time the three of them were supposed to meet. He's here already. I'm sorry, All Might. Tashinori waved off the apology with a gentle motion and, after giving Izuku one last pensive look, he crossed the room to open the door. Standing in the hallway was Mirio, his posture polite and his demeanor as confident as ever. He was dressed in an olive-green hoodie and sweatpants, since being on academic leave following the raid meant that he didn't have to wear a school uniform. Though most of his injuries were hidden beneath his clothes, Izuku knew that many of his wounds were still wrapped in bandages. He bowed respectfully to the UA teacher before entering the lounge. Mirio smiled, but Izuku couldn't return it. The weight of everything on his mind made it impossible to return. Izuku had already told Mirio that they would be discussing One for All with Tashinori today, and it seemed that the upperclassman understood the gravity of the topic. He tempered his usual exuberance as he settled onto the couch and sat attentively next to Izuku. Before they began, Tashinori filled his electric kettle with water and set out 3 empty cups on the short black table. Next to Izuku, Mirio seemed perfectly at ease. He looked calm. Casual even. Surely, Mirio had to have been just as uneasy as he was, but he concealed it much better. Just one more thing that Mirio is better at, Izuku thought grimly. One more reason he deserves one for all way more than me. So, Tashinori began, easing himself onto the sofa opposite them. Young Midoriya has told me he believes you will be the next to receive one for all. You should know this is not a suggestion that he makes lightly. Mirio looked at Izuku and then back to Tashinori, his expression guarded. That's what Midoriya said. Leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees, Tashinori narrowed his eyes. This is not something that I would even allow him to suggest if it weren't directed at the right candidate. The way that Mirio spoke was calm, cautious. But all might, with no disrespect to either of you, I don't have any interest in taking a quirk from an excellent soon-to-be hero. Tashinori raised a hand, and Mirio halted mid-sentence. It isn't taking. The quirk picks the next successor just as much as the current wielder does. And, young Togata, Tashinori shifted his gaze to Izuku, who nodded once. It seems that the quirk has chosen you. Mirio shook his head, wearing the same reluctant frown he'd worn when Izuku had told him the very same thing. That one for all was meant to be his. Tashinori began to explain one for all to Mirio, the history, its purpose, how it worked. Izuku noticed that the explanation was almost identical to how Tashinori had described it to him 8 months ago. Izuku suspected that these words weren't just a script. They were likely the same ones that Nana Shimura must have once used when she explained the quirk to Tashinori. They were probably the most important words he'd ever heard. As Tashinori spoke, Mirio listened intently, showing more restraint than Izuku had when he'd first heard the explanation. Mirio held back his questions and comments, choosing instead to simply listen, absorbing every word. When the electric kettle began to tremble as the water inside reached a boil, Tashinori paused his explanation to tend to it. He added loose tea leaves to the strainer, letting them begin to steep as he returned to his seat. As they waited on the tea, he continued, detailing the two greatest purposes of one for all, to be honed and strengthened by each wielder for the next successor, and to be used as a force to stop evil, particularly all for one. Next, he explained to Mirio that, if he did inherit the quirk, he would one day be responsible for passing one for all on to its next user. When Tashinori finished speaking, Mirio's gaze shifted to what lay beyond the window, sitting in contemplative silence for several minutes. The soft hum of the kettle and the ticking of the lounge clock were the only sounds in the room. Finally, Mirio turned back, and he looked directly at Izuku. So, if I took this quirk, what would happen to you, Midoriya? You just become quirkless? Izuku winced. Even now, hearing the word quirkus stung like an insult. He would retain some of the powers of one for all for a small PRD after passing it on, Tashinori answered. I don't know how much power, or for how long. I still have some amount of power remaining from when I passed it on, albeit extremely limited, and it's been 8 months since I passed the quirk to young Midoriya. Mirio's navy blue eyes flicked to Tashinori, then back to Izuku. His eyes narrowed slightly, as though piecing something together, before widening in sudden realization. So, Midoriya, did you not have a quirk before one for all? No, Izuku turned his head away, his eye tightening as he spoke. That vulnerability, that flaw, was now laid bare, unearthed and exposed. That's incredible. Izuku blinked, wide-eyed and stunned into silence. Mirio leaned toward him, grabbing him gently by the bicep and giving it a light shake. Izuku was certain he'd have been more exuberant if not for the unhealed wounds he still bore. You've gone from quirkless to one of the best heroes in training in just 8 months. You're living that dream you've always had. Isn't that awesome? The huge, radiant, and utterly awestruck smile that Mirio wore was overwhelming to Izuku. It felt like he's standing under the blazing summer sun without sunglasses or sunscreen. It was unwelcome right now. It made him feel like he was burning up under a spotlight. I don't deserve this praise from you. You've started with less than any single one of us here at UA High School and you've become something incredible. Mirio pulled back, and Izuku watched the weight of remorse settle into his features. I can't. I really can't take your quirk away from you, Midoriya. I can't do that to you. Mirio was referring to making Midoriya quirkless again. He didn't want to say it as if he knew how much it could sting, and he probably did know, now that he was quirkless himself. Unfortunately, Toshinori's voice pulled both boys' heads towards him. If the quirk itself has made its decision, then it would be strong for young Midoriya to convince it otherwise. Toshinori exhaled deeply, his expression grave. One for all has chosen you, young Togata. The quirk knows more than any of us alone could. It wants you to use it? Mirio blew out a big ball of air that puffed out his cheeks. He leaned back onto the couch, wincing just a little in the process, and then he folded his arms across his cheek, tipping his head to the side. And, what about if I end up getting my original quirk back from Eri? Toshinori regarded him curiously. Previous wielders of One for All were still able to use their original quirk, in addition to One for All. If you got your original quirk back, he shook his head with a bitter chuckle. You might just become the most powerful hero the world has ever seen. With a dismissive hand gesture, Mirio scoffed. No. Then, after a beat, he laughed. Thanks though. Huge coming from you. Big fan. He added this through the corner of his mouth, holding up his hands in Jazz hands for a moment, his grin teasing. The tension in his Izuku's shoulders diffused, if only for a mere second. Mirio cleared his throat and dropped his hands to his lap. But that's not what I mean. Could I give One for All back to Midoriya? If I got my original quirk back? Toshinori's brow furrowed, and he looked puzzled at the proposition. His brain having stalled, it took Izuku a moment to push out, "Give it back to me?" "Yeah," Mirio said, leaning forward slightly. "Couldn't I just give it back? You said it's transferred through DNA. Couldn't he just get his quirk back later?" At the silence that greeted Mirio's words, Izuku glanced at Toshinori, who looked just as stunned as he felt. Mirio, undeterred, pressed on. "You said one of the points of One for All was to better it and pass it on. What if I better it and then give it back?" Finally, Toshinori hummed in thought, closing his eyes. Izuku stared at Mirio. He was more concerned about leaving Izuku quirkless than he was about savoring the crime-stopping, life-saving power that came with wielding One for All. Toshinori stood up and carefully poured the first cup of tea. One for All has not existed very long. Quirks, themselves, have only existed in our society for around 200 years. He moved on to pour the second and third cups. Izuku reached for his, wrapping his hands around it, but he didn't feel like he could stomach a sip right now. To be honest, young Togata, Toshinori set the kettle back down. "I don't know. It wouldn't be up to just you. The quirk would need to agree as well. So I just convince it?" Mirio said simply. "Midoriya's been able to communicate with it, right? I just do that too." Toshinori looked to Izuku, perhaps wondering just how much he had shared with Mirio before their meeting today, before lowering himself back into his seat. "I can't tell you with certainty that communicating with it the way young Midoriya has will be possible. Everything that has been happening to young Midoriya while he has had One for All is novel. I, myself, never experienced many of the things he has." Mirio offered Izuku a look that was reassuring and warm. "No problem. If this quirk wants me to wield it so bad, I'll WHP it into something great with everything I've got, and then I'll give it right back to you, Midoriya. How does that sound?" The series of conflicting emotions that ran through Izuku were dizzying, and he pinched his eyes shut in a vain attempt to shut them out. "The quirk, you're supposed to use it to fight evil, not to?" His voice faltered. The reality that he would soon be quirkless again pressed harder and harder against him. "It doesn't matter what I want. This quirk is for saving lives, not for making me feel better." Mirio lay a hand on Izuku's shoulder, his expression shifting into a more sincere one. "Midoriya, I know we've not known each other for a long time, but when I look at you, I see the next #1 hero. I'm not kidding. I see something great in you." The discomfort he'd felt under Mirio's earlier smile and attention had festered into a burning unease that twisted in his stomach. It was as though Mirio were exposing each of Izuku's raw and painful insecurities, especially the ones he'd built because of Mirio himself. Mirio was everything Izuku believed that he wasn't, a constant reminder of how much he paled in comparison, And yet, here Mirio was telling him that he was the incredible one. Izuku began to blink back tears as Mirio continued to speak. You have something that nobody else out here has. You are going to change this world, I promise you. Mirio then smacked Izuku's shoulder, throwing him forward, dislodging a couple of the tears he was so desperately trying to hold back. So the very best thing I could do if this quirk wants me so bad is to get it all spiffed up so you can continue to use it, so save lives and kick evils, but, right? Wiping his eyes with the heels of his palms, Izuku allowed a shaky laugh to escape him. You can't curse in front of a teacher, Togata. Mirio grinned, then bowed his head toward Toshinori. Sorry about that, Mr. All Might, it was just the best phrase for the sentence. Toshinori was smiling, though there was a layer of wariness behind it that Izuku could see in his eyes. He seemed to be fighting to not show the doubt that Izuku knew he had on the matter. I hope that this plays out the way that you are wanting it to. Tears still fell from Izuku's face, and he couldn't help it. It had been many months since he'd last felt this vulnerable, this scared. The reality loomed over him like a shadow. He was really going to be quirkless again. He'd not even had one for all for a full year, and he was about to lose it. Toshinori picked up his cup of tea but didn't drink, simply cradling it in his hands. Young Midoriya and I have been meeting regularly to train. One for all is very difficult to wield in a way that isn't self-destructive. I encourage you to join us, young Togata, as soon as you're cleared by your physician. We'll need to start preparing your body to accept the quirk. Right? Mirio said, his hands clasping together as he leaned in, energy coiled in his frame. No rush though, Toshinori added gently. I don't want you to hurt yourself or risk impeding your recovery. We train every week and won't stop until young Midoriya has his professional hero license, so you can join us whenever you're ready. What? Izuku mumbled, and then blinked rapidly, trying to clear his watery vision enough to read Toshinori's face. You're still a good kid with a good head on his shoulders, Toshinori said softly. Since we've started training together, you've grown much stronger outside of your quirk, if you've realized it or not. There's so much you'll still be able to do without one for all. It will be strong, but I know you can do it. I'm confident that we can still make you a great hero, quirk or not. Nodding, Izuku bit his quivering lip, unable to will himself to say anything more. This was really happening. Mirio would receive one for all. Izuku would train to be a quirkless hero. This was what he wanted, wasn't it? Why did this feel so difficult, then? Why did it hurt so bad? Mirio glanced at Toshinori. Plenty of heroes nowadays have non-combat quirks and are still able to be effective heroes because of the support items that they use. I'm sure we can find something perfect for that sharp brain of yours. With a playful grin, Mirio poked at the side of Izuku's head, and though Izuku swatted at his hand, a small smile tugged at his lips. You're too smart and too good to not do hero work, Mirio continued. Quirk or no quirk? Thanks, Togata, Izuku said quietly. The trio shifted into discussing the logistics of the quirk transfer and what would need to happen to facilitate it. Toshinori detailed the training Mirio would need to undergo to be physically ready to receive one for all. He noted that Mirio's athleticism already placed him much further along than Izuku had been when he first began his preparations. Toshinori explained the technicalities of the transfer itself, ingesting DNA, such as a strand of hair, in combination with the current wielder declaring their intention to pass the power on. Finally, Toshinori emphasized the absolute importance of not discussing one for all with anyone else, underlining how dangerous its existence could be in the wrong hands. After about 20 minutes of planning and discussion, the three of them sat around the table, not one of them saying a word. 3 empty teacups rested on the surface, and 3 exhausted faces reflected the weight of the conversation they just had. All Might question? Mirio scrubbed a hand down his face, the weight of the dire conversation obviously pressing down on him. I get that this quirk could attract some nasty attention, so you don't want me to talk about it once I get it. But how am I supposed to explain it to my friends and family when they see that the quirk I'm using is not even remotely the same as the permeation that they know? I mean, heck, all that my classmates know right now is that I'm not coming back to classes for a while because of the raid. They haven't even suspected that I've lost it, let alone gained a different one. Izuku knew that the police had put Mirio on a strict GG order to prevent news of the quirk reversal bullet from reaching the public and causing panic. He hadn't known it had extended to his close friends, classmates, and family too. Mirio picked up his teacup and tapped it on the table a few times, the soft rhythm filling the silence. And even if the school didn't notice me having a new quirk, which they definitely will, with all the blood work they've been doing to study this whole DNA reversal situation, they'd notice the change in Izuku the moment he returned to class. No doubt about it. Tashinori's shoulders sagged as though suffering under the weight of their conversation. The concern you bring up is one I've had on my mind all day, young Togata. Give me a little more time to think on it. He looked from Mirio to Izuku as he continued, in the meantime, we must keep silent on the matter. It might work in our favor that the police and UA are trying so strong to keep you out of the public spotlight. Though a frown lingered on his face, Mirio nodded. We've had a long and heavy discussion today, boys. Let's wrap it up here, Tashinori said as he began stacking up their teacups. Go get some rest and we can talk more about this tomorrow. I'm sure you'll come up with plenty of questions, young Togata, and I will do my best to answer them for you. Mirio stood to leave, which took a little bit of effort as he struggled to not strain his wounds, but Izuku stayed rooted in his seat. All Might, can I have a word with you? Of course. Young Togata, if you don't mind? Mirio turned to Izuku, holding out his hand like he wanted a handshake, but the second that Izuku reached out, Mirio grabbed him by the wrist and pulled into a hug. Clapping him twice on the back, Mirio said with a wide grin, I get the feeling you and I are about to get real close, yeah? With footsteps that were impossibly light following the weight of their discussion, Mirio moved to the door. At the doorway, Mirio paused and gave Izuku a wave. We got this, Midoriya. Whatever comes next. With that, Mirio disappeared into the hallway. The door clicked shut, leaving the lounge in another bout of silence punctuated only by the ticking of the nearby clock. Izuku gave his attention back to Tashinori, who looked slightly surprised. He probably hadn't expected Izuku to say anything more after such a thorough discussion. I wanted to ask you about something you said earlier, that I'd still make a good hero, even without a quirk. Guilt lumped up in Izuku's throat for keeping his mentor here with something that probably seemed so trivial after they'd already been talking for nearly an hour, but he was being suffocated by his own thoughts. His heart ached with the same persistent sting of a carpet burn. When we first met, you told me that I couldn't be a hero without a quirk. Izuku hesitated, and his further words died off in his throat. He didn't know how to ask this without it sounding accusatory, and that was the absolute last thing he wanted when it came to his lifelong idol. Before Izuku could say more, however, Tashinori spoke gently. I understand. Izuku sagged back into the couch, but not with relief. Why did it feel so selfish to ask for this explanation? Young Midoriya, I shouldn't have told you that you couldn't be a hero without a quirk. Tashinori swallowed strong, guilt shadowing his features. It wasn't right of me. When I was young and quirkless, support items were still uncommon. Over and over as I grew up, I was told what we all believed at the time to be true, that I couldn't be a hero without a quirk. Izuku had been told that same thing his whole life, even with today's widespread use of support items. His heart hurt for the young Tashinori who desperately wanted to do good, but was only ever told that it was impossible for him. Once I received one for all and became a hero, somebody so completely different from the person I was before, it only cemented the belief that I would have never amounted to anything without a quirk. So, when I saw you that day, I just repeated what I'd been told my entire life. But that didn't make it right. And, for that, young Midoriya, I'm sorry. Tashinori lay his palms flat on his thighs and bowed low. I do hope that you will forgive me. Izuku gasped and his hands flailed in a panic. All Might, please don't apologize to me, please get up. His mentor slowly sat upright again, and Izuku let out a shaky breath, his hands falling back into his lap. For a moment he hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table and before lifting to meet Tashinori's with a somber look. Honestly, I can't blame you for that. I know what it's like to carry the things people say in your heart every single day, the things they said to put you down. You try so strong not to believe them, but sometimes, you do. Izuku's mind wandered to a certain crimson-eyed flame child. With a steadying breath he sat up straighter, a determination shining in his eyes, one that he hoped reminded Toshinori of exactly why he'd picked Izuku as his successor. "I'll prove them all wrong," he said, his voice firm. "I'll show everyone who ever doubted me, and everyone who doubted you too, that you don't need a quirk to be a great hero. I'm going to be the best one there is." With a wistful smile, Toshinori turned to look out the window. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his words were soft. "I do want you to know that I'm going to grieve the loss of you as the wielder of One for All. To me, no other person could ever so perfectly embody the next symbol of peace." Izuku was humbled by the praise, but the finality of them stung. Toshinori continued, his tone growing darker. "But with today's villains stronger than they've ever been, I don't know that we have any other choice than to take risks such as this one, especially if the quirk is encouraging you to do it." The words "take risks" sent a chill through Izuku, and he clenched his fists against his thighs to ground himself. "I am very sorry to have played with your emotions at all, young Midoriya." Toshinori looked carefully at his pupil. "I'm not going to give up on your training, or on seeing it through that you become a fine hero." Izuku stood up to shake his mentor's hand, but when Toshinori smiled warmly and clasped his smaller hand in both of his own, emotion swelled in Izuku's eye. All he'd ever needed was somebody who was willing to believe in him, to give him time and guidance, to give him the simple reassurance that he could become a hero. And now, not only did he have just that, it was from him. The man who had given him everything. His childhood idol. The symbol of peace. The strongest hero in the world. Overcome, Izuku rushed forward and threw his arms around Toshinori, pulling him into a tight hug, eyes stinging with tears. Toshinori lifted his arms awkwardly at first, surprised, but after a moment he chuckled and wrapped them around Izuku. "You're going to be all right, young Midoriya. Don't give up on me, and I will see you through to the end. I promise." By the time Izuku stepped out of the academic building and into the crisp December air, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the campus in hues of amber and gold. Pulling his scarf up against the chill, Izuku began making his way towards the dormitory, his thoughts a whirlwind of everything Toshinori had said that evening. Doubts that he'd already experienced once that day suddenly returned, dropping heavy in his mind like stones into water. This was what Izuku wanted, wasn't it? Why did this feel so difficult, then? Why did it hurt so bad? He nearly stopped in his tracks when he saw a familiar figure waiting on a bench just ahead. In the warm, auburn light of the setting sun, Mirio's skin and hair seemed to blend into the glow, as if he were part of the light itself. "Midoriya," Mirio called, his voice bright and full of energy. He pushed himself up from the bench with a little wince and then waved enthusiastically, as though Izuku could possibly miss him, the only other person walking around the campus in this biting cold. "Togata?" Izuku's breath puffed visibly in the chilly air. He closed the small distance in a jog, feeling a throb of guilt at the thought of his upperclassmen waiting out in the cold for him. You waited for me?" Instead of answering, Mirio held his phone out with a grin. "Add yourself?" Yeah, okay." Izuku took the phone, his fingers stiff with cold and fumbling a little as he punched in his contact information. Mirio shoved his hands into his pockets and looked out over the campus, an easy look on his face. "I meant what I said today, you know." Izuku hit save and handed his phone back to him. "About improving One for All and then giving it back to me?" As he tucked his phone away, Mirio shook his head. "About there being something great in you. Something that nobody else around here has." He started walking towards the dormitories, and Izuku hesitated for a moment before falling into step beside him, his eye tightening at the sincerity in Mirio's voice. "What about you?" Izuku stared at the pavement underfoot as the flurry of insecurities he'd felt in Mirio's hospital room came rushing back, red-hot and raw. "You have everything. You're confident, you impress everyone you meet, you're funny, good at talking to people." Mirai's voice sounded in Izuku's head, ordinary. That's what Mirai had called him. If he was ordinary, then what did that make Mirio? "You're extraordinary," Izuku finished quietly, his words barely making it past the scarf on his face. Mirio laughed, giving Izuku's shoulder a playful shove that almost sent him sideways into the lawn. Midoriya, you're gonna make my head too big. Listen. He stopped walking and turned to face Izuku, so Izuku stopped and faced him too. There is not a single thing that I have, or can do, that you can't. Izuku wrinkled his nose in disagreement, but before he could protest, Mirio grabbed both of his shoulders and gave him a gentle shake. I mean it. Mirio insisted, leaning close to Izuku's face. Stop searching for all the ways that my words are wrong and just hear them. Izuku furrowed his brow and tried to do what Mirio was asking, to just let the words in without pulling them apart in his head. Even as he made the effort, he already knew that it would probably be a futile order. I used to be shy and awkward and a total dunce. But work really strong to change those things about myself. Mirio's navy eyes were washed in the oranges of the evening light. I'm talking forcing myself into the spotlight every single day to kind of strong, even though I absolutely hated it. I made myself speak up more in class, introduce myself to more strangers, take on more extracurriculars, anything to make myself talk more. It took a lot of effort and it took years, but now... Mirio suddenly leaned back, puffing out his tea and planting his hands on his hips. Now look at me. He smirked and flexed his biceps like a bodybuilder, a glint of humor lighting his face. I'm great. Still a dunce. That part didn't change. He winked. While Izuku did laugh a little, it was a hollow and weak sound. As expected, he couldn't do what Mirio asked and just shut down the thoughts that dribbled in his head, cold and ominous like the beginnings of a thunderstorm. All he could think about was how far behind he was, how much work lay ahead of him if he wanted to compare, to not be left behind once he lost his quirk. He'd already done so much, poured so much sweat and tears into string one for all, and yet here he was, about to start over from square one. The recognition that he was years behind of Mirio, that he might never catch up to his charisma, confidence, or capability, was disheartening. What's on that mind of yours, Midoriya? Mirio prompted softly when Izuku didn't answer. Izuku hesitated, then sighed. Building confidence, being extraordinary, it feels like I'm going to be starting from zero all over again, he said bitterly. It's going to take a lot for me to catch up to you, if I ever do. Whoa. Mirio drawled out, sounding the way a cowboy might when instructing a horse to halt. Hey, hang on. 2 things. He held up an index finger. 1. You have made so much progress, Midoriya. I've seen it in just the short time I've known you. Not even counting the past year you've worked with all might. So don't you say that you're starting from zero, because that's not true. You've learned so much from UA, your friends, your internships. None of that is going to disappear just because you don't have one for all anymore. Izuku grimaced. Hearing it phrased like that, just because you don't have one for all anymore, stung. Lifting a second finger, Mirio continued, his face serious but his tone kind. 2. Your goal shouldn't be to catch up to me. You don't need to be me, Midoriya. You just need to be the very best version of you. That's why. Mirio grabbed his phone from his pocket and wiggled it at Izuku. I'm going to start giving you special confidence-building homework. I wanted to help you. What? Izuku squinted, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words that didn't sound pathetic. But what? This isn't about me anymore. Saying out loud felt like a punch to the stomach, and Izuku couldn't hide the second grimace that surfaced on his face. It never had been about him, had it? It had always been about one for all. Maybe that had been his destiny from the start, to wield it just long enough to pass it to someone more worthy. Someone like Mirio. These self-deprecating thoughts swirled and deepened, growing into something darker, something bleaker than the familiar sting of tears that usually accompanied overwhelming emotions. The feelings tied to the imminent loss of one for all were different. This was colder, heavier, and it lashed at him like rain driven by a brutal gale. Midoriya, I know it's strong for you to believe right now, but listen to me, you are going to be greater than me someday. I've already told you that, and I'll say it as many times as it takes for you to believe it. Mirio's voice softened, but his words carried an unwavering certainty. In fact, I'm going to make you a promise, right here and now. You're going to be the greatest hero, Midoriya, greater than me, greater than anyone. Even without a quirk. Because that's who you are. And just like that, with his sincerity and his patient smile, Mirio tempered the hurricane of vicious, self-deprecating doubts that had been raging in Izuku's head. Izuku couldn't trust himself, and he had virtually never once believed in himself, but he could trust Mirio. He could believe Mirio's promise, as unrealistic as it felt to Izuku right now. You just need the right support group to get you there, Mirio continued carefully. All Might is a great mentor for your hero skills. And me? Mirio chuckled and jabbed his thumb into his IT self-righteously. I'm going to help you with your being cool skills. Izuku swallowed. What was that? Mirio leaned closer to hear him, eyebrows hitched in concern. You'd have to learn those yourself before you could teach them to me, right? Izuku ventured with a wry little smile. For a moment, Mirio looked stunned, then he burst into a full-belly laugh that echoed on the empty walking path. Man, that's good. I think you're gonna be all right, kid. Kid? We're pretty much the same age, Togata. A lot can happen in 2 years. Mirio said with a grin, puffing out his IT as if to emphasize the wisdom of his seniority. The walk to the dormitory was short, and Izuku found himself slowing his steps, though he couldn't quite explain why. Mirio seemed to notice, casting him more than one curious glance, but he didn't say a word. Hey, Izuku finally said. I want to help you too. Mirio looked at him out of the corner of his eye, as though turning to face him might startle him out of what he was saying. Oh yeah. Izuku nodded, unable to look up from his red high-top sneakers. If you're going to help me every day to become less ordinary, he noticed that Mirio seemed a little confused by his word choice, but he continued without elaborating, I want to train with you on One for All. I know All Might will help you, and you really will learn a lot from him, but there's a lot of little things I've learned since I've had it. Tricks about how to control it, even special moves I've been training on that I'd love to see you work into their final versions. Sure. That sounds great, Midoriya. Mirio offered Izuku a smile, his eyes shining with warmth. I'll take any knowledge you're willing to give me. They reached the steps that lead up to the dormitory's entrance, and warmth replaced the heaviness in his IT. UA would still be his home. He would still study in Class 1A. He could still be a hero. For what had to be the 5th time that day, Izuku struggled to contain the building urge to cry, but it was for a different reason now. Relief. When are you going to teach me how to stop crying so much? Izuku half laughed, wiping at his moist eyes with the back of a hand. That's cool, Kid 101, right? There wasn't an ounce of mockery or disgust on his face as Mirio replied. Midoriya, being able to feel emotions so deeply and cry so freely is the coolest thing you can do. I mean that. You can train anybody to punch or jump, but you can't teach people to care. Don't ever lose that, and you're already well on your way to Cool Street. As Izuku followed Mirio up the stairs to the dorm, he paused and took a couple of seconds to ground himself. The Shie Hassaikai raid had changed, well, everything. All of the biggest parts of Izuku's life were about to change. Mirio was going to inherit One for All. Should Izuku even humor the idea of getting it back someday? Mirio grabbed the doorknob and then turned back to see Izuku standing a few steps behind him. Okay? Yeah. Izuku bounded up the steps and followed after Mirio. Things were changing, but not for the worse. Yeah, I'm okay. As he was about to cross the threshold into the dormitory, a chill crawled down the back of his neck, sharp and fleeting, like the scrape of a human nail. He whipped around, One for All already dancing across his skin in red-white rivulets, his eyes seeking, searching, but finding nothing. Mirio rushed out to stand at his side, following Izuku's lead and scanning the yard and then the far side of campus with a serious look. Midoriya? What happened? Izuku continued to stare at the far side of UA campus. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. No movement from afar, no abnormal shadows or figures, nothing. He allowed One for All to simmer back into his bones. Not sure. It might have been nothing. Following Izuku's gaze one last time, Mirio slowly nodded. If it's something bad, I dare it to try and get on campus now that they've upgraded the security. They'd be vaporized, and then their ashes would be kicked into nothing by all the pro heroes who showed up. Izuku nodded too, amused by Mirio's detailed description of their fates, and the boys entered the dormitory, though not without Izuku sparing one last look over his shoulder before the door closed. "Way to go, Suzuki." From within the dense cluster of old trees that loomed just outside the chain-link fence encircling UA's sprawling campus, two figures crouched low in the deepening shadows. The pair were 10 hours into a surveillance mission. Their bodies leaned cautiously out from either side of a thick oak tree, watching as the dormitory doors closed behind the two students they'd been watching. As the campus lights flickered on to ward off the encroaching dusk, their glow caught the annoyance written all over Ayashimin's face. He withdrew to the shadows behind the tree with a melodramatic sigh. "We're on day 1 of this mission and you already almost got us caught. Wouldn't have happened if Rosetta were here." Cookie, who had remained as still as a statue, finally withdrew to his side, the soft rustle of leaves accompanying her movement. "Well, she's busy, so you're stuck with me. My quirk can usually travel that far," Cookie muttered, her tone low and thoughtful. The fabric of her windbreaker whispered against itself as she folded her arms. "I think there's something with their new security system that interfered." Ayashimin sagged against the tree and began to pull on the calf-high fabric boots he'd kicked off for the time they'd spent stationary. "Welp, they're probably not coming out again till morning. Can we go get grub now? I'm starving." "Is food all you ever think about?" Koyuki snapped, though she began to walk away from UA campus in a decisive way that made Ayashimin perk up. Hopping to his feet, the boy squirmed to push his feet snugly into the toes of his boots, and then fell in line behind her. "Wow. I didn't think that would work." "It didn't?" Cookie said flatly, pressing ahead without looking back at the effeminate boy. "I know somebody who might be able to help us with the barrier problem." Ayashimin pulled a very specific red canister out of his pocket. He rolled the cork reversal bullet in his fingers and then put it away. "Bummer we couldn't even get one of them today." "We're only on day 1, Aya," Cookie said, her voice low with exhaustion. "We might not get an opportunity to hit one of them for weeks or months." A beat of silence punctuated by their footsteps over the grassy forest floor. "Look," Koyuki said, "if you want to go and get something to eat while I work on finding Mina, that's your..." She glanced over her shoulder and Ayashimin was already 5 meters in the other direction, arms swing cheerily. "Prerogative." With a shake of her head, Cookie pulled a pocket-sized notebook from her jacket, flipping it open to the latest page filled with cramped, precise notes on UA campus. Her online research had already provided the basics: class schedules, meal breaks, and even school policies, to include the requirement for a special pass to leave campus on weekdays, making weekends the most probable time to encounter one of their 6 targets in the city. Today's observations had added more context. She had also roughly determined what purpose each campus building served, what areas the students most enjoyed loitering around, and which teachers seemed to supervise them most frequently. What she really needed to know was what their 6 targets did with their time outside of classes, whether they went off campus at all, and, most importantly, who they spent that free time with. Insights into their mental health would be a valuable little bonus, especially if Koyuki could pick up on any signs of stress or vulnerability that could be exploited. Which, after observing that interaction between Izuku Midoriya and Mirio Togata, she reckoned that she had. As she weaved through the trees toward the road where she'd left the car parked, her pen hovered over the notebook's page, the faint scrawl of her previous notes almost lost to the heavy shadows of night. She jotted down one last thought for the night: Midoriya Izuku visibly distressed, potential to be first target. Togata improves his condition? Need to separate. With a decisive snap, the notebook closed, and with a steely resolve in her stride, she vanished into the forest. The distant sound of Ayashimin humming a tune somewhere in the woods was the only echo of their presence on UA's campus that day. A middle-aged man in a beat-up Carhartt jacket sauntered straight down the center of an empty street, his arms spread wide and palms up as though inviting Mirio and Izuku closer. The early morning light glinted off a thin layer of frost on the sidewalks, and each exhale from the UA students turned into a puff of white. Distant car horns echoed from the busier blocks of Mustafu, but here, the road they occupied was starkly empty. Good, Izuku thought. It was safer to confront villains when there were fewer citizens around. Side by side, Izuku and Mirio stood in the path of this villain. In their pressed winter uniforms, they hardly came off as imposing. Izuku straightened up his posture and puffed out his tea, anything to project strength and certainty to the approaching enemy. They may just be a couple of high schoolers, but right now, they were the only people standing between this man and the vulnerable residential area beyond. Come on, heroes, the villain taunted. Atop his head was a mess of bleached hair that was pulled into a high bun, stray strands falling over sleepy eyes and a lazy smile. You here to stop me, or did you just want front row seats to the show? Minutes ago, Izuku and Mirio had received alerts on the Villain Live app about a man who had reduced an entire car sales lot to piles of twisted metal and shattered glass. Already close by, they'd searched the surrounding streets and found this man 2 blocks away, strolling about the city like he had all the time in the world. Izuku and Mirio exchanged a look. Izuku could see uncertainty in the knit of Mirio's brow, and he wasn't feeling too optimistic himself. He hadn't seen any specific information on the app regarding this villain's quirk, information from bystanders that might explain how he'd destroyed the car lot. It was anyone's guess what they were up against. I think he'd have attacked us already if he had a ranged quirk. Izuku spoke low to keep the man from overhearing what he shared. With Mirio, he calculated the shrinking distance between them. The man would be within striking range in less than 10 seconds. That thing he's doing with his hands, it's got to be a touch-based quirk. We need to be careful until we know for sure, though. Mirio flashed Izuku $1 million smile. Don't worry, Zook. Careful's my middle name. Before Izuku had a chance to respond, the villain suddenly darted away from them, heading for the line of cars parked along the street. He slapped his palm onto a black pickup's hood, then a white sedan's door, and finally a teal coupe's fender as he passed. Each vehicle began to rattle at his touch, their bodies vibrating and humming with a supernatural light. The pair of students began to back away as the ground shuddered beneath their feet. Izuku's jaw dropped as the vehicles began to shift and grow, steel frames contorting upwards, doors warping into arms, grills twisting into metallic faces. Legs, hands, torsos, heads. Before their very eyes, the vehicles changed shape into hulking anthropomorphic machines, and Izuku noted that they almost looked like Transformers? Mirio gasped, his eyes twinkling with childlike wonder. Look out! Izuku's warning cut through the air just as one of the mechanical behemoths lifted an arm and shot a projectile at them. Both boys leapt in opposite directions as the asphalt they'd stood on a moment prior was pulverized in a deafening explosion. Fragments of pavement skittered around their feet and pelleted against their bodies like a flurry of hornet stings. He's running! Mirio called, already sprinting after the villain in a blur of movement. Izuku wanted to follow, but he had a problem. All 3 of the automotive mechas had converged upon him, blocking his path. We're doing it the strong way, then, Izuku muttered to himself, knees bending as he channeled One for All. That familiar buzz of power spun up in his belly and shot down his legs like a live wire. He launched himself toward the closest mecha, the black pickup truck, which lunged with outstretched arms as if to pluck him out of the air. Izuku was faster. He twisted and drove a roundhouse kick through the robot's torso. It staggered backward until the white sedan mecha shoved it out of the way, sending it to the ground where it stilled and did not move again. The sedan mecha wasted no time, descending upon Izuku as his feet reconnected with the asphalt. As he tried to leap out of the way, the robot caught him in its huge metal fingers and lifted him high off the ground, squeezing his torso so tightly that it drove the air from his lungs. Thinking fast, Izuku forced One for All into his arms and he ripped himself free with its power, sending pieces of the robot's fingers in every direction. Izuku sprang backward, completing a full backflip before landing several meters away in a crouch. Sparks showered from where Izuku had destroyed the mecha's hands. Izuku! The sheer distress in that cry caused Izuku's BLD to run cold. He whipped around and spotted Mirio, restrained in the bare hug of a yellow mecha. For more robots were closing in and the villain was nowhere to be seen. 2 of the mechas clocked Izuku and tore away from Mirio to intercept him. One for All burned steadily in his limbs as he vaulted off the body of the fallen pickup mecha and hurtled towards the next closest robot like a bullet. His heart pounded as he landed squarely on the shoulder of the teal coupe robot, and when its arms flew up to try and seize him, Izuku latched onto its shoulder plates and kicked both legs out sideways, knocking its head clean off its body. No time to pause. Izuku hurled himself towards the oncoming pair of robots, his eyes narrowing as he singled out the one he would attack first. He aimed for the center of its ihi, intending to drive his feet straight through its core and come out the other side. Something went wrong. His feet punctured the alloy shell and snagged in a tangle of scalding steel pipes, electrical wiring, and dense machinery. The engine block. The halt he came to was jarring, and a scream ripped from his throat unbidden as agonizing pain flared along his legs. Izuku began to thrash, tried to kick and push himself free, but the maze of tubing and wires held him fast. To make matters worse, the damaged engine began shooting hot oil into the air like a foul geyser, filling his eyes, his nose, his mouth. He sputtered and choked, blinking furiously as he tried to wipe the oil away in vain. It clung to him, blinding and suffocating. "Mirio!" Izuku choked out, voice ragged, though somewhere in the back of his mind he knew that his quirkless friend was less equipped to provide aid than he was. "I can't get out, Izuku!" Mirio's yell reached through the chaos, sharp and strained. They were in trouble. Another deafening explosion rocked them from nearby, the shockwave vibrating through the metal that encased him. Was it the villain making his escape, or were more of his transformed mechas damaging the city around them? Had they begun to target the apartments nearby? How much longer until pro-heroes arrived? Could they hold out until then? Izuku didn't think so. The relentless spray of oil left him no refuge, no angle to turn his head that would allow him to steal a clean breath. His entire face seemed to burn, and every inhale was a fight against the greasy flood. He tried to focus, tried to put together some plan to escape, but his thoughts refused to rationalize, his lungs refused to cooperate. "Calm down, Izuku. Activate one for all." The command echoed uselessly in his head. Panic gripped him tighter than the twisted metal around his legs. Lightheadedness began to creep in, threatening to pull him under. "Your gum." The relief in Mirio's voice was just as confusing as what he'd just said, and Izuku couldn't afford the air it would have cost for him to request clarification. Suddenly, a powerful sensation tore through Izuku's body, rattling him on the inside like he was a snow globe in an earthquake. His ears filled with the rush of whispers that he'd heard multiple times before, voices that he knew belonged to the previous wielders of One for All. Their voices were shrill now, roaring in a disjointed, excited chorus. Izuku felt it. He could feel the exact moment that the presence of One for All shattered within him, breaking into a million tiny shards of power that began to float through his body, chaotic and scattered, present but untethered. He knew without trying that in this state, it would be impossible to command or unify that power in the same way that he had before. The sensation was jarring, like trying to grasp smoke with trembling hands, and he stilled where he dangled from the mecha's core. His quirk, he could feel it fading. He was losing it now, right here, which meant that Mirio was... A burst of noise erupted nearby, followed by a metallic commotion, and then arms, human arms, wrapped around his torso, wrenching him free from the mecha. It took everything in Izuku not to lash out or shriek from the pain that lanced through his legs. Mirio's voice was in his ear, steady and reassuring. "I've got you, buddy." Mirio eased Izuku down. As soon as his feet hit solid ground, Izuku collapsed forward. The cold, gritty pavement bit into his palms as he retched and hacked, desperately gulping down untainted air. "Be back in 10 seconds?" Izuku was unable to reply. Still catching his breath, still blinded, all he could do was listen to the screech of metal being torn apart, feel the ground tremble as heavy bodies hit the ground. He vainly tried to wipe his eyes with filthy hands as Mirio battled the mechas, his grunts punctuating the crunching and crashing that filled the air. One by one, the remaining robots were downed, and soon the only sounds in the desolate street was Izuku's coughing and the faint hiss of settling debris. Warmth reached Izuku in the form of gentle hands. Mirio was back, and he began wiping the oil from Izuku's face with something soft. As his vision began to clear, he noticed two things. 1, Mirio had taken off his shirt to clean Izuku's face, and 2, a red-white electricity danced along Mirio's torso, his arms, his legs. A very familiar red-white electricity. You've got it, Izuku managed as his gasping began to even out. He lay his hand over his own ziti as if that would secure the last of his remaining power, keep it from bleeding away. He wasn't ready. Yeah, Mirio muttered. There was kindness in the way he scanned Izuku for injuries, for his reaction to this change. My arms and legs didn't shoot off either, so there's that. How are your legs? Izuku ghosted his hands over his legs, trying to recall his first aid training through the haze of pain and exhaustion. To his surprise, his dark navy breathes had not been ripped or punctured. With Mirio's help, he carefully tugged the fabric up to his knees, the cold air biting against his exposed skin. While the flesh they uncovered was red and raw, painted in a latticework of angry welts and burgeoning bruises, they found no bleeding, no evidence of broken bones. When Izuku wiggled his toes, they responded. If he could stand, he could still fight. Behind Mirio, the street was littered with craters, mangled metal limbs, shattered wheels, and the scrap piles of the defeated mechas. With a decisive and dramatic inhale, Izuku extended his hand. Help me up. Mirio looked from his battered legs back to his face. Izuku, that's a terrible idea. Yeah, probably. Izuku wiggled his hand for Mirio. Help me up. Mirio made a reluctant noise as he clasped Izuku's wrist and hoisted him up. Pain lashed up both of his legs, sharp and hot. Izuku bent forward, hands braced on his knees, hardly daring to breathe as the world swam in and out of focus. After a handful of seconds, the pain subsided into something manageable. It took a couple of tries, but Izuku was able to stay upright without Mirio's support. I'm good. He scanned his legs one last time, and then focused his attention on the oil that soaked his clothes and was smudged all over his arms, and he peered closer at his skin. It was faint, but unmistakable. His arms were still thrumming with the very same electricity that ran on Mirio's limbs now. Tashinori had said that Izuku should have some residual power after passing on One for All. Could he still wield it, direct it, harness the power that remained? Izuku reached into himself and probed for the quirk. He pushed the power down into his legs, just to see if it was really still there. He felt the power answer. It was not as vivid, certainly weaker than it had been before, but it was there, and it buzzed into his aching legs as directed. Relief surged through him. He wasn't quirkless just yet. Izuku still had some power to work with. Though his heart was aching as he grieved what he'd given up, and what Mirio had just gained, he forced himself to ignore these feelings. There was no time to unravel the knot of emotions in his not when there were still people in danger, when there was a villain to be stopped. Let's go. Izuku willed the storm inside of him to steady, and he planted one shaky, resolute step in the direction that the villain had fled. And, Mirio? Yeah, buddy. You should probably put your shirt back on. 1 month earlier. The physical therapy lounge was heated against the December chill, but it radiated warmth in more ways than one. It was obvious that a great deal of care had been put into the floor plan and decor here, the thoughtful design choices creating a soothing, relaxing space for recovering patients. The yoga mats, exercise machines, and exam tables basked in the gentle glow of overhead lights. From floor-to-ceiling windows, afternoon sunlight spilled in, softening the conversations between patients and their physical therapists. Shelves and cubbies along the walls boasted an array of foam rollers, resistance bands, and recovery tools. Izuku wasn't even the one receiving therapy and yet was benefiting from the relaxing effects of the lounge. He sagged back in his seat against the far wall, his eyes drifting over the half-dozen patients working with their therapists. None of them looked like heroes or villains, just a collection of ordinary people repairing their bodies after life's misfortunes. His gaze stopped when it landed on Mirio, who was supposed to be performing basic mobility exercises. Instead, due to an abundance of vitality, Mirio often leapt when instructed to step, flexed muscles that he was supposed to be relaxing, or hollered when he was supposed to gently exhale. It was driving his physical therapist crazy. Izuku bit back his laughter, knowing that any sign of amusement would only encourage Mirio's antics. It had been 2 days since Izuku, Tashinori, and Mirio had met in the teacher's lounge to talk about One for All. When he'd been discharged from the hospital earlier in the week, He had been instructed by his doctor to return to the hospital bi-weekly for physical therapy sessions. He was making remarkable progress and at this pace would likely finish his program before the end of December. Thanks to advanced healing quirks like recovery girls and the marvels of modern medicine, Mirio had mended with astonishing speed. He tackled today's exercises with a fluidity and vigor that belied the severity of his recent injuries. It had barely been a week since the day of the raid, yet his cuts and scrapes had healed into faint pinkish marks, his bruises had faded almost completely, and his fractured ribs had improved enough that he'd returned to giving Izuku and his friends his notorious bone-crushing hugs. Izuku gave Mirio a thumbs up as his friend was guided to the doorframe of a small office to begin his shoulder stretches. His therapist stood at his side, clearly ready to pounce if Mirio decided to grab the top of the door and start doing pull-ups, for the second time that day. To Izuku, it seemed that Mirio's physical therapy regimen was probably more of a precaution than a necessity, a standard protocol for patients recovering from extensive physical trauma. In Mirio's case, it almost seemed that this was more trouble than it was worth, given the sheer effort his therapist had to expend just to keep Mirio from overexerting himself. After finishing the exercise, his therapist called for a quick break. Mirio sauntered over to where Izuku sat. His hands were shoved into his pockets and he wore his usual easy smile. "I appreciate you coming, Midoriya," Mirio said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "The therapist has definitely been less fussy with you here. I'd better keep bringing you out to be my buffer." Izuku offered him a pointed, incredulous look. "You're only getting fussed at because you're doing way too much. I watched you do a burpee when the guy asked you to do a cat and cow stretch. Wait until he finds out you've been at the gym between sessions? Shoo, that's our secret." Mirio flopped down into the chair next to Izuku, sighing heavily through his nose. "It's just so strong to take it slow. Can't go and work out like I want, can't use my quirk, can't go to class, can't even leave campus without a chaperone." He was referring to Ryo Inui, hero name Hound Dog, who stood by the entrance with his arms crossed over his st. He was performing his duty as Mirio's bodyguard with utmost seriousness, glaring daggers at every nurse, patient, and hospital staff member who walked past the door to the physical therapy room. "Since losing my quirk, I feel so, I don't know, inconvenient. I want to get back to where I was already." Mirio sat forward and rubbed his face. A faint, buzzing static rose in Izuku's mind, like a radio just off frequency. He willed to voices to quiet down so he could listen to his friend. "Sorry, Midoriya." Mirio groaned and lowered his hands enough to peer over at Izuku. "I shouldn't even be complaining. I know things could be a lot worse. I mean, you don't have to say sorry. This hasn't been easy on anyone." Izuku's hand hovered before landing lightly on Mirio's shoulder. He gave an imploring squeeze. "The fastest way for you to get back to normal is by not pushing yourself so strong that you get hurt all over again." But Mirio's navy eyes flicked to Izuku's hand and then to his face. His expression softened as did his voice. "No, you're right. I should cool it a little." Despite his words, his leg bobbed restlessly, like his body was refusing to comply with his brain, rearing to go without respite. Neither of them spoke for a few tense seconds. "I wouldn't trade being a hero for anything, but I gotta admit, the hero path SCKS sometimes." Mirio's voice was tired, small, stripped of its usual bravado. "I mean, we're kids. We should be enjoying high school, hanging with our friends, traveling, going on dates, getting ready for our futures. Not all of this. Hospitalizations, gang crimes, child abuse, funerals." His voice cracked on the last word, and he didn't try to continue. They sat in silence. Mirio's physical therapist popped out of the office and signaled to him. "Sorry about that, phone call with the boss. You ready to keep going?" Slapping his palms on his thighs, Mirio rose from the chair with a sudden burst of energy. Though his usual smile was plastered back on his face, the weariness in his voice betrayed the effort behind it. "Well, back to it." As Mirio returned to his exercises, Izuku could tell that he was making a genuine attempt to follow the therapist's instructions more carefully, to use less unnecessary force. Despite his efforts, about 5 minutes later, A resistance band still snapped with a sharp twang that made everyone in the room jump and sent Rio into a growling fit. Izuku shook his head and chuckled into closed lips. For a brief moment, Mirio had allowed Izuku to see the vulnerability behind his usually impenetrable cheerful facade. Somehow, that small glimpse of honesty made Izuku feel closer to him. Izuku's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his head. From Ida Tenya. Midoriya. Myself, Uraraka, and Todoroki are going to be in the student lounge from now until approximately 8:30. It would be most delightful if you would join us. Izuku stared at his phone screen, index finger hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to join them, he really did, but he knew in his bones that it wouldn't take long for their conversation to turn to the raid, or to quirk training, or to how he was holding up. Even the mere idea of fielding those questions, of forcing a smile and pretending he was fine right now, left him feeling wrung out. He wasn't Mirio, he would not be able to keep up a cheerful front without it cracking, and he couldn't think of anything worse than breaking down in front of his closest friends when he wouldn't be able to reassure them with the truth of what was going on. Sighing, he typed a quick excuse about being busy with raid follow-up work. Tenya responded almost immediately, "Understood. I trust you are remaining diligent in your studies." Then a second text came through. "If you want to talk about anything, I am here to support you, Midoriya." Izuku's heart hurt. Of course he wanted the support of his friends, he wanted to share the weight of what he carried with them, but he knew that wasn't an option. It was too dangerous, too complicated. Shooting back a quick thanks Ida, he pocketed his phone and let his eyes drift shut. The silver lining in all of this was Mirio. Gaining Mirio as a friend, someone so strong, kind, and steadfast, it made the uncertain future seem the littlest bit more palatable. Izuku wanted to return the favor of Mirio's kindness, to anchor Mirio in the way Mirio had anchored him this past week. Maybe, just maybe, they could hold each other up through whatever came next. A gnawing pit of guilt opened up beneath that sense of hope, swallowing it whole. Mirio hadn't chosen this path of his own accord. He'd been swept into it when One for All picked him. Izuku knew firsthand how isolating and dangerous of a secret it was, and now Mirio would carry it too. Could they truly support each other, or by sharing this burden were they at risk of being dragged down even further? As these thoughts crossed his mind, the sensation of indecipherable whispering tickled the edges of his consciousness. It's him. Though he willed the voices of the quirk to quiet down, they ignored him, demanding to be heard. A commotion brought Izuku back to the present. He opened his eyes to see Tamaki Amajiki and Nijire Hado at the door, peering up at Ryo Inui as he blocked their path, bristling and growling. After a brief PRD of scrutiny and some intense sniffing, he allowed them entry. While Tamaki lingered near the door, perhaps working up the courage to walk into a room full of strangers, Nijire breezed across the floor and pulled Mirio into a hug, her energy as light and sweeping as a fresh spring breeze. She turned to his therapist with a bow and said, "Thank you for taking care of him." As Mirio continued his exercises, Nijire stayed at his side, her voice a cheerful stream of chatter. She talked about how much the class missed him, how eager she was to finish the combo moves they'd been working on, and how she and Tamaki were keen to see him back in action. "It won't be long," he assured, his tone brimming with confidence. "I'll be right back there with you all. Somebody's got to keep Tamaki in check after all." Izuku watched with a mix of admiration and unease. Mirio was so good at deflecting concern. He made it look effortless, the way he wrapped his friends in warmth, humor, and even white lies to shield them from harsher truths. Nijire didn't seem to suspect a thing, but Izuku knew what Mirio had omitted. He might never be back in class with her again, might never be able to finish those combos they'd been perfecting with his permeation and her wave motion. Meanwhile, Tamaki had noticed Izuku. Instead of joining Nijire and Mirio, he slowly followed the wall to the visitor chairs and stopped a few feet away. He tarried, fidgeting with his hands, eyes cast downward. When he spoke, his voice was flat and quiet. "You're here for Togata?" It was classic Tamaki, Izuku mused. No greeting, no preamble. Straight to the point, like he was reluctant to even use his voice. "Yeah," Izuku replied, and because he certainly couldn't tell Tamaki the real reason that he was here, To support Mirio as he prepared to receive one for all, he added, got sent here with Hound Dog. Just keeping an eye on him since his quirk is. He trailed off, knowing Tamaki understood since he'd been at the raid. The upperclassman made a gruff sound in acknowledgement and wandered over to Mirio and Nijire without another word. From his seat across the room, Izuku watched the big three share in a candid, unguarded moment, feeling like an outsider to something fragile and precious. Mirio's banter mingled with Nijire's laughter, and even Tamaki spared the tiniest of smirks as the conversation naturally pulled him in. They shared in the kind of effortless camaraderie that came from being a part of something greater than friendship alone. They were bound by shared experiences, responsibilities, expectations. Izuku didn't often find himself witness to the three of them interacting like this, and even though their friendship warmed his heart a little, it was only to a certain extent. The delicate balance of this trio teetered on the edge of change. As simple as a moment like this seemed, it was on borrowed time. The therapist's polite request to let Mirio finish his exercises broke the spell. Nijire waved goodbye as she took her leave, Tamaki trailing close behind. Before crossing the doorway, Tamaki glanced back at his childhood friend. Mirio shot him a thumbs up as if to say, "I've got this." Tamaki looked conflicted. Then he nodded and took his leave. The room felt heavier in their absence. Mirio felt it too. His cheer had wilted slightly, evident in the way that he scrubbed a hand down his face and pressed on his eyes for a few seconds before resuming his exercises. Izuku watched as Mirio flopped down onto a mat for some floor exercises, his therapist squatting down next to him. Izuku harbored sympathy not just for Mirio, but for Tamaki too. Tamaki surely recognized that his childhood friend was under immense stress and wrestling with doubts about the future. Was Mirio opening up to him about it? Izuku doubted it. Mirio probably had it in his head that venting would bring down his friends. And even if Mirio wanted to open up, there was only so much of what was happening in his life currently that Mirio could share with Tamaki. No matter how deep their friendship ran, some burdens could only be shared with someone who knew the whole truth. Someone like Izuku. Toshinori also knew, of course, but opening up to a teacher, to All Might, was different. With Izuku, though, Mirio had already allowed his guard down. He'd already shared with him glimpses of his worries, and he'd not shut Izuku down when he'd tried to allay them. Maybe Izuku already was being an anchor to Mirio, more than he'd realized. He was determined to keep being that safe space for him, to be the person Mirio leaned on as they drove ahead. Standing up from his chair, Izuku crossed the room and knelt beside Mirio, who was pulling his knee across his hips in a single leg stretch. "Hey," Izuku said, offering a smile. "Let's finish this strong." Mirio's eyebrows shot up in surprise and, like a dam bursting, the light returned to his face and eyes. "Okay, big guy, let's see what you've got. This is some pretty serious stuff, you know. May not be able to handle it." Beaming at his facetiousness, Izuku settled onto the next mat over, ready to push through the final minutes together. Actions spoke louder than words, and Izuku hoped that Mirio understood. You're not going forward alone. In the early hours of the very next day, the dim glow of Izuku's phone screen was the sole light in his dorm room. The message he drafted out was simple: having a rough night. You up? And yet he couldn't make himself hit send. After almost a minute of staring at his screen, the cursor blinking at him like a taunt, he deleted the text and set his phone on the nightstand face down. He'd typed out messages to Achiko, Tenya, and Mirio more than once, but each time he read over what he'd come up with, he lost his nerve. He told himself it was because he didn't want to wake them up at 3 in the morning, though deep down, he knew it was his fear of admitting to his friends that he was struggling. Now, he lay on his back in the wake of his last nightmare, sheets twisted around him and his shirt soaked in sweat. Sleep eluded him despite multiple attempts. Each time that he closed his eyes, he was dragged into a tangle of nightmares. The first one took him back to the labyrinthine halls beneath the Shie Hassaikai base, where, with bated breath, Izuku had followed in the footsteps of the police and pro-heroes, fear spiking at every blind corner, not knowing if this might be where the battle would begin. When it finally did, the terrible sounds of combat, of police and pro-heroes and his classmates being injured, blurred into the background, becoming secondary to the terror of the underground halls themselves as they moved in on Izuku with a deafening groan, smashing him in a fluid and swift movement, crushing his bones and suffocating him. In another twisted scene, Eri's cranberry-red eyes locked onto his, wide with horror, as she was wrenched off the ground by Kai Chisaki's hands. She flew through the air, down the maze of white halls, as Izuku gave chase, reaching, desperate, but he was never quite able to catch up. She vanished into the darkness at the end of that endless hall, her cries echoing long after she disappeared. The nightmares only grew more abstract, less grounded in reality. In the final, awful dream he'd had before giving up on sleep entirely, he found himself trapped inside of a collapsing building, falling down, down, down as debris rained around him in clouds and sparks. When he finally hit the ground, he was too winded to move, and he was forced to watch in mounting terror as concrete and rubble piled on top of him, trapping him, his world growing darker and darker beneath the crushing weight. He could hear his classmates, his friends, calling out for help, their voices edged with pain and fear. When he activated One for All to free himself from the rubble, it didn't come. He tried and tried, but One for All was gone, and he had no way to escape his entrapment, no way to save his friends. After this dream woke him up with his heart so high in his throat that he believed he might vomit, he decided that was it. He wasn't going to subject himself back to those nightmares again. All the way up until his 6 a.m. alarm blared, Izuku drifted in and out of a restless haze, never falling completely asleep. The exhaustion of the night had settled into his bones, and the muscles in his face felt leaden and sluggish as he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to blink the sleep away. A low thrum of anxiety buzzed perpetually in his ear, making his mind abnormally skittish. He was perturbed by the shadows in his room, startled by the ventilation fan in the bathroom that he'd heard 100 times before, and unnerved by the faint red glow of the numbers on his digital desk clock. He didn't like the idea of attending class while feeling this anxious, but the mental image of presenting himself to the medical ward and citing nightmares as his reason for a sick day made his stomach twist with embarrassment. A cup of coffee before class hadn't helped. If anything, the caffeine might have made things worse. Izuku sat at his desk, his eyes on Shota Aizawa as he gave a lecture about ethics in hero work. His teacher's words slipped in one ear and out the other without landing where it needed to. For as exhausted and unable to focus on classwork as he was, his brain was in overdrive when it came to his anxieties, his thoughts darting around like a rat in a maze. It was maddening. Around him, the low murmur of his classmates' sidebar conversations blended with the scratches of pencil on paper and the occasional shuffle of turning pages. The room had the muted stillness of an early morning class, where focus ebbed and flowed between bouts of drowsiness. These sounds, usually soothing in their familiarity, did nothing to ground him. For what had to be the 10th time since class started, Izuku started to think about the raid. The memory of Mirai laying still in his hospital bed flashed in his head, followed by Eri. It made his heart hurt to think about all that she had missed, the innocent joys of childhood, quality time with family, playdates with other kids. Would she ever recover from such deep trauma? Could she? He thought of his mom, how sick with worry she was lately, how she tried to hide her mounting anxiety with every new mission that her son went on, but Izuku knew, always knew how much it bothered her. He could see it in the lines around her eyes, he could feel it in the hugs that lingered for just a second too long, and he could sense it in the way that she stared mutely at the scars that had begun accumulating across his body since joining UA's Hero Academy. Focus, Izuku. Izuku tried to ground himself with some deep breathing, as though that might seal off the discord that buzzed in his head like a swarm of agitated wasps. It didn't help. He watched Shota's chalk move across the board, the words fogging together. Mirio. One for all. The soundless voices began their murmuring, of course, whenever these sorts of thoughts filled his mind. While he truly sympathized with Mirio's loss, the thought of giving up One for All really upset him. That didn't make sense, since he'd been the one to suggest it in the first place, so why did it continue to feel like a punch to the gut? Then, there was the bigger picture, the terrifying close call that Japan had just survived. If the Shie Hassaikai had succeeded in mass-producing those quirk-erasing bullets, society would have fallen apart. Which hero would have been targeted next? How many innocent people would have lost their quirks to the Yakuza? His anxieties were pressing against his skull and pushing down on his stomach. He rubbed his temples absently, even though he knew better than to believe that this would relieve the stress that festered there. That's when a strong kick landed on the back of his chair and startled Izuku, causing him to drop his mechanical pencil to the floor. A couple of the students sitting closest to them turned at the commotion. He retrieved his pencil and then twisted around to meet Katsuki's gaze, his own expression a cross between confused and cautious. Kaken? The blonde was leaning back in his seat with his arms folded across his knee. He glared at Izuku through half-lidded eyes. What's your deal? Izuku just stared at him. He hadn't realized he was being that obvious. Nothing, Kaken, Izuku muttered, voice low to avoid drawing Shota's attention. Even if he could find a way to concentrate everything going on into one sentence, he still wouldn't be able to talk about it. Not the parts that were bothering him the most, at least. As he turned and scooted back up to his desk, a second kick hit the back of his chair. Izuku turned around pointedly. Katsuki was undeterred by his show of annoyance. Don't ignore me. I said, what's your deal? Izuku opened his mouth to say something, anything to get out of this conversation and off Katsuki's radar, but before he could speak, Shota's voice cut in from the front of the classroom. Is there something you want to share with the class, Bakugo and Midoriya? Izuku whipped around to his teacher, his heart stopping in his tea as a sea of curious faces turned to peer at him and Katsuki. No, he answered quickly, and after a millisecond of hesitation he stood up. Actually, I need to go to the restroom. Don't dawdle. Shota held Izuku's gaze briefly before he turned back to the board and resumed writing. Izuku stepped into the hallway, wiping the sweat from his forehead as soon as he was out of eyeshot. He was grateful for the chance to stretch his legs and take his mind somewhere else. The bathroom was empty. A splash of tepid water from the sink onto his face did little to calm his nerves. He checked his phone and found a message from Mirio. Got your first confidence building HW. You are coming me to hang W airy tomorrow. Mr. Aizawa will take us. We leave at 4. It'll be awesome. Izuku texted back that he'd be there. At least hanging with Eri and Mirio felt like something his brain could handle in its current state, something that would relieve his stress instead of add to it. When he returned to class, Katsuki looked suspicious, but he didn't bother Izuku again. The rest of the morning's lessons drifted by in a blur of half-heard sentences and half-hearted notes. By the time the lunch bell rang, Izuku had to ignore the way his stomach growled. The concept of eating made his insides churn. He hastily slung his backpack over his shoulders, intending to escape before any of his classmates tried to pull him into after-class chatter. That was when Tenya appeared at his desk, his presence persistent and unavoidable. The taller student's sharp eyes were tight with concern, his frown subtle but telling. Midoriya, we missed you last night. While we successfully completed our group study, your absence was noticeable. He pushed up his glasses, a nervous habit more than a necessity. Are you doing all right? Izuku managed a thin smile. Thanks, Ida. I'm okay. There's definitely a ton on my mind, but it's stuff I can't really talk about, because of the raid. It was a half-truth, but it was enough. Tenya's brow furrowed and he nodded solemnly. I understand. If it's related to the raid, I won't pry. But remember, Midoriya, your friends are here for you. He looked over his shoulder. Achiko was nowhere to be seen, but Todoroki was still packing his backpack. It might help to spend some time with us soon, even if just to take your mind off things. I'll try. Izuku hoped that Tenya could read the appreciation on his face and tell that it was sincere. Thank you, Ida. When Izuku left the classroom, all he could think about was how appealing the privacy and peace of his room sounded. His phone vibrated with a new text from Mirio. He invited Izuku to join Nijire, Tamaki, and himself for lunch. While Izuku was flattered that Mirio wanted to include him in a meal with his closest friends, and he was allured by the opportunity to pick the brains of the big three, to maybe learn new things from them, he ultimately declined. He wasn't in the right mood to do anything social, and his appetite was non-existent anyway. Izuku declined, a pang of guilt following the message he sent. What if it's just us? The follow-up text almost earned a yes from Izuku. Being alone with Mirio sounded like a breath of fresh air. He wouldn't have to hide anything. Mirio would let him vent and say something wise to make him feel better, as he always did. Maybe he would even have some advice about tackling the nightmares that had plagued him all night. But then guilt crept in. Nijire and Tamaki needed Mirio too, maybe even more than Izuku did. They weren't getting to see Mirio as much because of the academic leave that UA had him on. As much as Izuku longed for Mirio's support and company, taking him away from his friends felt selfish. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Izuku started typing out another polite decline. He was still focused on his phone when he rounded a corner and accidentally bumped right into Achiko. She managed a small smile and a wave, though the bags under her eyes gave him pause. She looked just as tired as he felt. "You're alone?" Izuku asked, glancing past her, expecting to see Ida or Azui. "Yeah," she said, studying Izuku carefully. He shifted self-consciously as she looked over his disheveled uniform and the tension in his jaw. "Skipping lunch too, huh?" Izuku tried for a casual shrug. "Not really hungry. Let's walk together, then." As they moved through the academic building together, their footsteps mingled with the distant chatter of students headed to the cafeteria. When they exited into the courtyard, the crisp afternoon air greeted them, and a cool breeze brushed against Izuku's cheeks and neck. It was nice out here, considering the season, he thought. People weren't loitering outside like they would in warmer weather, giving them privacy, which was apparently what Achiko was waiting for. "Bakugo stopped me on the way out of class to tell me you were bothering him with all of your demon sighing, as he put it. He's never complained to me before about you." I knew it was his way of saying he was concerned, to get me to check on you. She smiled at him. "He's so difficult." Izuku couldn't fight the smirk that crept onto his own face. "I've known him my entire life and still haven't figured out how to deal with him. He's lucky I like him so much." They fell silent as a pair of students headed toward the academic building past them. Once they were out of earshot, Achiko spoke again. "So, what's up, Midoriya? What's got you so stressed?" "Uraraka, it's really okay." Izuku started, but Achiko cut him off, her voice firm. I'm fine, Midoriya." She lifted her nose indignantly, scowling. "Women have a sixth sense for these things, you know. Plus, you kinda look like you've been through a shredder." Izuku laughed, holding his hands up in surrender. There's definitely a lot in my head right now, yeah, but I wouldn't even know where to start." She didn't say anything, just stared at him with that small frown, patient and determined, waiting for him to figure it out. He sighed, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He admired her stubbornness, the way she cared so deeply about her friends. "All right. The raid mostly. But I can't exactly talk about it just yet." He looked away from her. "I know you're trying to be a good friend, Uraraka. I don't mean to shut you out. I really can't. I am actually forbidden from talking about it." The pause that followed was long enough that Izuku thought she was going to argue. Instead, she simply said, "I understand. Sorry." The grass of the courtyard had browned in the last cold snap they'd had. A few flyers for upcoming extracurricular activities clung to lamp posts and walls. There was a single bird sitting on the back of a bench nearby, singing a pleasant song as if in defiance of the gloomy, overcast weather. "If you can't talk to me, can you talk to someone else? Mr. Aizawa was at the raid, can you talk to him? Or, if it can't be another student, maybe your mom?" "Not Mr. Aizawa," Izuku said quickly. He couldn't imagine his stoic teacher trying to deal with a student's fragile emotions, not because Shota didn't care, but because he didn't seem the type to handle people with delicate gloves. "As for my mom, I don't want to stress her out more than I already have. If she knew how stressed out I was, it would break her heart. Don't you think she'd want to help you?" "Why, yes, she would, but what?" Achiko pressed, her head tipping to the side. "Let your mom do mom things. If she's the person you're most comfortable talking to right now, you should tell her what you can." "I'll think about it," Izuku promised. He studied her again, how her hair lacked its usual shine and how her lips were red and raw from where she'd been chewing them. "What about you? Have you told your own family about how you're doing after the raid? Or anyone?" Achiko's fingers tightened around the handles of her briefcase, her discomfort clear. A little. As much as I'm allowed to, with all the NDA stuff. They know I'm grieving. We all are, I guess. Yeah. Izuku deeply empathized with the exhaustion in her voice. What's bothering you the most? Her reply was immediate. Sir Naitai. This answer caught Izuku off guard. I can't stop thinking about when I was holding him, right after he was injured. Her face pinched and her voice grew tight with grief as she spoke. I keep replaying it, wondering what I could have done differently. Maybe if I'd learned more emergency medicine, or if I hadn't moved him around so much when I was trying to get him out of the underground. Uraraka, Izuku started gently, though his voice was lost under Achiko's as she pressed on. I keep telling myself there had to be another option, some timeline where I was able to save him. In my head, it almost feels like it's my fault, not because I caused it, but because I wasn't good enough to do something about it. Hey! Izuku grabbed Achiko's wrist gently, stopping them both. Sir Naitai's wounds were severe. Internal. There was nothing you could have done. If anything, your actions gave him time, enough time that everyone who cared about him got to say goodbye. That matters, Uraraka. Do you really know that there was nothing I could have done? She challenged, pulling her wrist away. Her caramel gaze smoldered as it bore into his. When he hesitated, she sighed and deflated, looking away. Sorry. You're probably right. It's just, I still see him every night when I try to sleep. And when I'm alone, it still eats at me. In the silence that followed, Achiko began walking towards the dorms again. Izuku fell in step beside her, his throat tight. I'm having trouble with nightmares too. Can't focus in class. Sometimes it feel like I'm barely staying upright while the rest of the class is carrying on without a care in the world. Yeah, Achiko's chuckle was devoid of any humor. Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like. Add in anxiety attacks and the not able to eat thing and it's just perfect. Izuku's heart broke for her as she spoke. Uraraka, have you thought about seeing the school psychologist? It's private, free. I think it might help more than talking to any of us can. Her low, musing hum was tinged with sadness. If I go, will you go too? No. I can't, Izuku said, wincing slightly. Not yet. Me neither, she said softly, but I can say that talking to you has helped. Even if it didn't solve anything, it's nice to know I'm not alone. Not crazy. I'm glad to have you as a friend through this, Deku. Thanks. Izuku's ears heated up at the praise. You're not crazy at all, so don't think that. I don't think any of us who were at the raid are okay right now. Achiko paused at the steps leading up into the dormitory. We might not be for a while. That's normal for trauma. Her unimpressed tone bothered Izuku a little. It was like she was trying to convince herself that being traumatized was totally unremarkable and completely normal for a couple of high schoolers. I'm sure you've heard this 100 times, but it's okay to not be okay, she continued as she began moving up the steps. It's the part where you bottle everything up and internalize everything that causes issues. Like with Ida, Izuku murmured. He remembered watching Tenya grow more and more distant after the attack on his brother. Festered in his misery and hate until his emotions manifested in an attempt to fight Stain on his own, a suicide mission. He didn't want to witness anyone he cared about go through that again. And my friends probably don't want to see me go through that, either. Achiko inspected her reflection in the glass of the dorm doors. She ran her fingers through her hair to shape it to her face a little better, adjusted the collar on her uniform blouse. She bit her lip for a second, seeming to steel herself, and then she turned to face Izuku. Can we talk like this again sometime? Nice, you know? Of course, Izuku said, and he meant it. Thanks. Achiko's face was graced with warmth as she pulled open the door. One last thing. No skipping dinner since you skipped lunch. I'll do the same. Deal? Deal. If you don't send me a picture, I'll come knocking. They entered the dormitories. Izuku flopped onto his bed, too drained to even take off his shoes. While he was certainly no less exhausted, he felt solace in his friendship with Achiko. His world might still be spinning off its axis, and the future might still be an uncertain mess, but at least he would be facing it with the support of his friends. The late afternoon sun was just low enough to bypass the foliage of the trees, sending rays straight into Izuku's eyes and making him squint as he breathed. They were in their usual secluded spot on the outer edge of campus where a spattering of trees kept them hidden, a deserted area that was ideal for discreet training sessions. Izuku stood a few feet away from Toshinori, hands on his hips as he caught his breath. Their training for the day was done, leaving his hoodie soaked in sweat and his muscles sore. His heart still pounded from the intensity of everything they'd done. Today's session had been focused on building the skills that would keep Izuku effective in emergencies, even after passing on One for All. He'd worked through mobility drills, strength training, and high-stress decision-making. This included low crawls, bounding movements that ended in burpees, and dragging a weighted dummy across the clearing. To finish, Toshinori had tested his decision-making abilities while under duress with flashcards depicting disaster scenarios and villain attacks. Each time Izuku hesitated too long or answered incorrectly, he was ordered to sprint to the far end of the clearing and back before immediately being expected to tackle the next card. This new style of training was somehow more exhausting than the long hours of combat drills he'd previously endured while trying to develop One for All special moves, and he didn't think it had anything to do with what little sleep he'd gotten. By the end of their training, Izuku's limbs were leaden, his legs trembling with each step. "You did very well today, young Midoriya." Toshinori zipped up his windbreaker, preparing to take his leave. "We'll pick up where we left off next week, so get some rest." "Thanks, All Might." Together, Izuku and Toshinori tucked the training dummy into its regular hiding spot among the shrubs near the clearing's edge. A cool breeze crawled along the ground, biting at Izuku's sweat-damp hoodie and making him shiver. As Toshinori straightened from the shrubs and began wiped the dirt from the mannequin off his hands, Izuku managed a shy, Toshinori caught his eye, the tilt of his head inviting and patient. "Can we talk about One for All again?" Izuku shoved his hands into his hoodie pockets, restless. He didn't want to annoy Toshinori, but after the day he'd had, he desperately craved reassurance. "Of course. What about it?" "Sorry," Izuku mumbled, rubbing the back of his arm self-consciously. Is this even going to be worth all the effort? You really think I'll still be able to be a hero after this?" He knew he sounded like a broken record, but he couldn't help it. He was scared. "Yes, I do." Toshinori stepped closer, his eyes thoughtful as he picked his words. The most powerful part of One for All never came from the quirk itself. It came from the user. He smiled and pointed at the center of Izuku's, his finger hovering close to the fabric of his hoodie. "Your heart, your drive, and your choices are going to be what make you a great hero. You had all three before One for All, and you'll have all three long after the last traces of it are gone." Toshinori's gentle words were like a candle in the dark, pushing back the shadows of his fear. "Thanks, All Might." Toshinori dipped his head to his pupil. "Of course." As Izuku made his way back to his room, Toshinori's parting words rang in his mind. "What happens next is your story to write. And trust me, young Midoriya, you're going to write it well." He had flipped on the light, closed the door, and was in the process of kicking off his shoes when his phone began buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it from his pocket and froze. His first instinct was to deny the call, to send her a text that he was busy. He didn't want to drag her down with the news of his bad day. Then he saw Achiko in his mind, exhausted, like he was, urging him to open up. Maybe if he did this, it would help her do the same. He curled and uncurled his fingers, centering his thoughts, before swiping to accept the call. "Hi, Mom," he greeted, trying to force brightness into his voice. "Izuku. Oh, it's so good to hear your voice, my sweet baby. How's everything? How are you?" Inko's voice came through his speakers sudden and fast, like cold water exploding out of a shower head. It was such a classic behavior for his mom that it brought a smile to his face. Managing. Training has been intense." She chuckled softly, her words slowing down and growing wistful. "I can imagine. Are you taking care of yourself? Keeping up in class? I know you and your friends have been through a lot lately, and I worry about how you're handling it." Stressed was an understatement. "Let your mom do mom things." "Actually, I'm feeling pretty bad, Mom." Izuku shifted on the edge of his bed. His ankles were crossed tightly and his free hand fidgeted with a green lock of hair. Since the raid, it's been strong to eat, focus, or sleep. It's just been a lot. When it came to doing mom things, she didn't disappoint. She never had. My baby, she breathed, and Izuku could practically see her hand rising to cover her mouth. I'm so sorry you're feeling this way. You must be so overwhelmed. I am, Izuku admitted weakly. She sighed gently. You always try to carry everything by yourself. You don't have to handle all of this alone, you know. Yeah, I know. There was a pause, a soft space where he could feel her listening. Can you tell me more about what's bothering you? I want to help. Is it everything that happened at the raid? Izuku swallowed and lay back on his bed, his feet still hanging off the side. Yeah, part of it. There's a lot that I can't stop thinking about. The battle that killed Sir Night Eye, the little girl we saved, watching how my friends have been affected, it's a lot. I couldn't even eat today. It just felt impossible. Oh, Izuku. The heartbreak in her voice made him feel small. He hadn't wanted to upset his mom, but her concern, her unwavering love for him, mended a hurt that hadn't yet been eased after talking to Achiko or Toshinori. It's no wonder you feel so drained. Heroes need to take care of themselves, too, not just the people they're rescuing. Izuku draped the back of his free arm over his eyes, hiding under its weight as he braced himself to continue. There's something else too. That's okay, baby. What is it? I think my future is about to change, in a big way, because of this raid. Izuku's body trembled as he drew in a deep breath. I'm scared. I don't like not knowing what's going to happen. It's really, really bothering me, Mom. Honey. Inko's steady voice was a lifeline, a sound that Izuku hadn't known he needed so badly until hearing it. Change is scary, I know. But you're stronger than you realize. You've made it through so much already, and you'll get through this too, even if you can't see it yet. We'll take it one day at a time, okay? I'll be right here with you, supporting you, no matter what happens. A tear slid down his cheek, light and hopeful. Thanks, Mom. I love you, my appealing son. She drew a deep breath. When she spoke again, her tone was full of resolve. All right, I'm making you something to eat. How about oyakodon? You need to keep your strength up. There was a faint shuffle on the other end, likely her already checking the cabinets for ingredients. Can you meet me at the gate in about an hour? I'll start on it now and then bring it over. Does that sound okay? Izuku wiped his cheek with the back of a hand, his lips twitching up. That would be perfect, Mom. The idea of seeing his mom, of feeling her arms around him, was something he'd pay any price to experience right now. And he would. A deep gratitude for her love filled him to the brim. After their call ended, Izuku showered and changed into clean clothes. He stretched sore muscles and combed his hair, feeling more like himself than he had in days. When he checked his phone again, new texts from Achiko and Mirio were waiting for him. Achiko's text was a photo of a bowl of white rice beside a crispy, fried pork cutlet. It looked greasy and delicious. Her follow-up text read, "My dinner. Smiley face. Comfort food. Oh. Did you eat? That looks really good," Izuku texted back. In a second text, he typed, "I'm about to. Mom is bringing me dinner." Then he checked the texts from Mirio. "WIDRN? Wanna come hang in the pony me and Tamaki? Asterisk pony. Bobby. Human autocorrect." Mirio's texting style was pure, unfiltered chaos, and it made Izuku huff in amusement. He considered Mirio's offer to hang out, but his exhaustion made the decision for him. "Sorry, I'm going to stay in and study. Maybe tomorrow?" That's when a text from his mom came in, letting him know she was 10 minutes away. Izuku snagged a jacket from where it lay in a heap on his dresser and headed out of his room. The walk to the gate took less than 5 minutes, and the chilly evening air invigorated his tired body. He greeted other students in passing but didn't stop. He approached the campus entrance and the sight of his mother waiting for him, with a warm smile on her face and a cloth-wrapped container in her hands, felt like a beacon of hope. Yearning surged through him, and his grin widened as he quickened his pace, practically jogging to close the distance between them. "Mom," he called softly, his voice thick with emotions. His heart swelled and he blinked rapidly, willing himself not to cry with the sheer relief he felt. When he passed through the gate, the security system keeping her from coming to him, Inko set down the container and enveloped him in a tight hug. Her embrace was as warm and reassuring as ever. Izuku clung to her, grateful for her presence and genuine concern. He didn't pull away, and neither did she. "Oh, my sweet boy," she murmured. "I have been so worried about you. Every single day." When she pulled back, her hands still ghosting the sides of Izuku's arms, her eyes were glistening with moisture. "Mom," Izuku started because if she cried he surely would too. She shook her head. "It's okay. I'm just so proud of you, Izuku." She used her pinky fingernail to lift the bead of moisture that had escaped the corner of her eye. "My appealing, strong, perfect son." Izuku closed his eyes briefly, letting her praise wash over him. The sight of his mother so worried made his itsy burn with shame, but he didn't allow that feeling to fester. It felt nice to be cared about, to be loved like this. He'd needed this. "Thanks, Mum." Inko picked the container up from the ground and handed it to him. "Please, promise me you'll let me know if you need anything else, okay? I'll make you dinner anytime you want. Let me take care of you." The warmth that radiated from the container heated his fingers and thawed the ice that had squeezed his heart for the past week. "I will. Thank you." Inko cupped his head in her warm hands and embraced his forehead tenderly. "I love you, Izuku." "I love you too, Mom." He would never be too proud to say it back. After they parted, Izuku walked back to his dorm, the container in his hands a tangible reminder of his mother's unwavering support. When he sat down at his desk and popped open the lid, the mouth-watering scent of oyakudon poured out of the bowl and filled his room. He took a picture of the bowl and sent it to Achiko. "I took your advice and got rewarded with oyakudon. Maybe you do have all the answers." Smiley face. "Your turn to talk to your parents?" Achiko's reply came fast. "A home-cooked meal does sound pretty nice right now." With each bite, he felt the kind of love that settled deep in his heart and smoothed the hurt that had been bothering him so deeply this week. When he opened his notebook to review what he wrote in class that day, the words were a jumble of unfinished sentences and random words that he could hardly decipher. "So much for studying. I'll get the notes from Tenya tomorrow." His phone screen lit up with a new and uncanny message from Mirio. "How's studying going? Plus Ultra?" Izuku stared at his notebook. His anxiety had been quelled and his exhaustion had dissipated some. He felt good. He picked up his phone and typed his response. "I could use a break." "Too late to accept your invite?" Mirio's reply came almost instantly. "Envy are too late. Meet you in 10. As he left his room to meet up with Mirio and Tamaki, the warmth from his mother's support propelled him forward. For the first time since the raid, he felt optimistic about facing the future, and the weight of what he carried seemed a little bit lighter. That same evening, in the suburbs of Yakuza City, the hideout that hosted the remaining Shie Hassaikai members was decent enough. It was a forgettable single-family dwelling tucked back a ways from the main road, shielded by a thick wall of bamboo that ran along the street-facing property line. Though the curtains were always drawn and the front door was never used, it was comfortable enough, especially for its location. Hosu City's rampant crime and high criminal population provided the perfect cover for the Shie Hassaikai to blend in seamlessly. When scoping out this house as a suitable location for their new base, Ayashimine discovered that the neighbors frequently abused narcotics and were likely to stay out of their affairs as long as they did the same. In the sparsely lit basement, a somber meeting was about to begin. 10 Shie Hassaikai members sat around a massive, scarred table, their faces cast in the meager glow of a few salvaged lamps. It was the best they had managed since their hasty relocation into this new base. Koyuki, Rosetta, Ayashimine, and Meduso were among those attending, their expressions ranging from interested to irritated. Arakumo loomed in the far corner of the room, his elongated form half-shrouded in shadow and his head twitching in a markedly insectoid way with every sudden movement. Once the last member took their seat, the man who was marred by horrific spider anatomy strode forward, his 4 massive spider legs carrying him to the head of the table with a surprising fluidity. "Tina wants an update." Arakumo spoke through a bush of fluttering, hair-like pedipalps that covered the space where a mouth would be, his tone clipped. "He wants to see the next quirk reversed in no more than 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Rosetta was frowning as she spoke, drumming her acrylic nails on the tabletop. We're still early into gathering information. Surveillance on 6 different people is difficult. Yeah, it's especially strong when you're running surveillance on 6 people and also handling all the counter-surveillance against infiltration and police activity, Koyuki muttered, glaring sideways at Rosetta as she rested her cheek on her fist. Maybe one of these days you'll spend enough time away from Ryder to help the rest of us with our mission. Ayashimine coughed into his hand, trying to hide the aghast look on his face. Working on bringing him back. His quirk and experience will be an asset to our recovery. Though her tone was confident and cool, Rosetta was betrayed by the pink tinge to her cheeks. I thought we were trying to restore the Shie Hassaikai? Compose yourselves. All I need, Arakumo hissed in staccato, his gaze piercing as it snapped from Rosetta to Koki, is strong numbers, or objective information, that I can report to Tenga. Do we have anything at all? No, Koyuki huffed in a single, bitter laugh. Yes, Rosetta replied at the same time. Tell Tengai we've got a plan and can get the next quirk reversed soon. Arakumo stared at her through slitted eyes. His fangs clacked once, and then he abruptly left the room. I'd love to hear what this plan of yours is, Koyuki said once he was gone, folding her arms on the table, since I've actually been there every day and haven't seen any promising openings. At her side sat Mina Mizuhara, a girl with a bob of short green hair. Her posture was stiff, and she looked afraid to breathe too loud. Her fists were bunched tightly in her lap, and she only moved if it was to push up her circle-framed glasses. Oh, what we saw today is all we need. What was Mommy Boy's name? It was the one you'd already singled out, Koyuki? Koyuki pulled her notebook from her pocket and flipped through the notes she'd taken. Midoriya Izuku. We've just got to get him away from Togata Mirio. If we do or don't get them apart, it isn't like Togata has his quirk anyway. Rosetta crossed her legs. We'll need Aya, Meduso, you, that quirk-amplifying friend of yours, and somebody who is great at impersonations. Her ruby-red lips pulled into a smirk, and she curled a lock of shimmering red hair around one finger. Where can we find one of those, you think? When are we doing this? Ayashimine piped up. Today's Thursday, so, let's see, I'm busy tomorrow, Rosetta murmured, tapping her lower lip and staring up at the ceiling. Ryder, Koyuki scoffed. We all know it's Ryder. So how about Saturday? Rosetta finished brightly, like she hadn't heard Koyuki. Can you do Saturday? Koyuki murmured to Mina. She nodded shyly. All right, Rosetta. The crowd gathered at the table exchanged glances. Koyuki leaned forward, her dark eyes serious. Guess we'll try this plan of yours.